ain't a podcast that's flyer. You are now tuned in to Direct Misfire. Bensome, Huw, and Sellick. Tell everyone to tune in. Let's roll the dice. Let me show you what we doing. A fantasy war game. Play it smart and you win. What you know about the crystal pen and the retribution? Heroes, giants, and knights galore. It's an adventure. This is Kings of War. Let's go.
What does it mean to be a human of Panathor? To the other races of the world, the answer to this question is as elusive as it is to the humans themselves. In the taverns and bartering houses of Mantica, there is a common saying, a dwarf is a dwarf is a dwarf. Likewise, to describe something as elvish is to endow it with an immediate and widely understood set of characteristics. The mention of man, however, leads to a raised eyebrow, a stroked beard, and yet more questions. To talk of man is at once as meaningless and as meaningful as to talk of love, of gods, or of nature itself, for down to the last all men differ, each swayed by a unique, emotionally conflict heart, forever changeable.
Hello champs, and welcome once again to another Direct Misfire Army Review. I am your host Bensome, and joining me today, as always, is Sellick.
Hey guys.
As well as Huw.
What's up, homies?
As we discuss all things Kingdoms of Men. So, pull up a seat, grab a drink, and let's get into it. Alright gents, manly kingdoms of menly men.
Yes, the mans.
Do we just jump straight to hero, or what are we doing here?
I think we got to save him until later on, surely.
Okay.
Yeah, he's got to be the last. He always has to come last, because that's what he does.
Such an interesting hero as well.
Yeah. But if you don't know what we're talking about, wait till the end of the cast, then you will. Yeah. Okay, Kings of Men.
So why are we reviewing these suckers?
Why?
Yeah, why?
Because it's been a while since we've done a review and the people voted.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. But yeah, the people did vote. So the winner of the vote by a small margin, because people voted for lots of different armies, was, of course, the Twilight Kin. And then immediately after the poll was posted, Countercharge decided to do the Twilight Kin. So
thanks, Countercharge.
That's fine. I don't mind. So, I mean, head on over to Countercharge if you want to
definitely.
Listen to that one. It was a really good episode. I listened to it myself. So instead of having to pretend I know what the hell the Twilight Kin are doing, we went for the second most voted army, which was the Mans.
That's right. Kingdoms of Men won that one with 13% of our votes, which is pretty impressive. So
13, is it?
Yep, 13%. 13%.
I don't know. That's not very impressive.
Oh.
But anyway.
There are a lot of armies. So
yes, I suppose. Okay, Kingdoms of Men. They have an army special upgrade called Indomitable Will. And it's basically pop it on a unit, and once a game, during your turn, you can make that unit fearless, and they inspire themselves. And if that unit's wavered, you can pop it or burn it to become steady instead. It's pretty good.
I would say one of the best.
One of the best upgrades. It's not bad, but it's
No, it's.
I actually think
good.
it doesn't fit the army as well as you'd like to, which we'll get to eventually. But at least the way that I've been trying them out, I feel like it doesn't fit in beautifully. It's a little bit like the Ratkin one in that, well, it's one use, so it's similar to that. But also you really want it on like big units, big expensive units that you want to protect with that inspiring self, or that you really can't afford to have them waver. But if you're playing Kingdoms of Men in a style where you're putting lots of boots on the ground and that kind of thing, you don't necessarily want to be upgrading your very cheap units to be slightly braver.
I disagree, but anyway.
There's two key uses of it though, right? Like
yeah. I think it's fantastic for making sure that your little troops that you're sitting in the way don't get hit by a few ranged shots and then waver and then holding up the rest of your army.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to use it. I was going to say the two major ways of using it would, because you have to do it in your turn. If you know you're about to get charged, you can whack it on there, especially if you're not inspired already on that unit, because then it will start inspiring itself, and anticipate that charge and try to sort of hold down the fort. And the other way, which I think you'll end up using it this way more often, or at least get more value out of it, not necessarily more often. But when a unit wavers, because someone spikes the roll either with shooting or a lucky charge or whatever, the ability to go back to your turn, you already know it's wavered, so you just pop it off and then wavering gone, and you're back in business. So that's actually the most powerful thing about it, in my opinion.
that's exactly how I use it, Hugh. I use it as effectively a point and click Fury.
Fearless is so good, and it's quite cheap. And Fury costs more than that.
A foot guard horde with 25 attacks sitting there, and it's had a lucky nerve roll, and they've wavered him. I can then just pull that 10-point item out and just go, all right, I'm no longer wavered. Here's another 25 attacks back at you.
Yeah, how much is the Fury item? Is it 15 points?
Yeah, 15.
15.
Yeah, so if you think of it as like a 10-point Fury item with upside, because obviously the downside is
With
that you
also
can't use
Inspire.
Fury multiple times, but I mean, how often does that ever happen in a game anyway?
Yeah.
Like, it's only going to come up once. So it's basically Fury with a little bit of upside at a discount price. So when you think of it that way, it's pretty legit.
All right, so let's get on with the actual units themselves. So we'll start off with the infantry, top of the book, the shield wall, the basic boys. So these are speed 5, melee 4, and defense 4, no range attacks. Come in your troop, regiment, and hordes. The standard units, strength of 1, 3, and 4. The troop, 10 attacks, 9, 11, 65 points. The regiment has 12 attacks, 13, 15 nerve at 100 points, and the horde, 25 attacks, 20, 22 nerve at 165 points. They get no special rules, but you can't give them the Indomitable Will upgrade.
So these guys are 1 pip lower nerve than a lot of other units of sort of similar kind of role, but they're also cheap. So 100 points is the absolute cheapest that I know of unit that you can get that is unit strength 3, because regiments that are less than 100 are generally unit strength 2, and 100 or more are unit strength 3, so they're bang on that 100 mark.
Yep, the cheapest unlock as well.
Yeah, good point.
1 pip higher in nerve for the rubbish equivalents, so like goblins, which are also defense 4 and attacks and whatnot. They're usually 19, 21, so yeah, pretty average.
Yeah, I suppose they're that in-between mark, aren't they? Because like a dwarf or something will be your 14, 16 on a regiment, and your ratkin or goblin will be 12, 14. So these guys fit in the middle there, 13, 15.
Yeah, I think the only way to look at the shield wall is if you need a cheap unlock and you're not expecting too much from them.
And they also make great chaff, I find, the troop with the Indomitable Will for 75 points for a fearless little speed bump there. It's hard to get cheaper than that to be more reliable.
Fearless 11.
Sorry?
Fearless 11.
Yeah, Fearless 11. What did I say?
Well, you just said fearless, but I was just emphasizing that fearless
okay.
11 is not good.
No, Fearless 11's good.
75 points, so you can't ask for that much. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't be choosing that chaff option if it was me. But
Well, I do, and it's good.
go for it. Okay, when we get to militia, you'll change your mind. But sure.
Nah, I won't, and I'll tell you why.
Okay, cool.
So what's coming up next?
Polearms block.
Mm-hmm.
The polearms infantry block are a bit of a different beast. They're 5 speed, 4+ melee, 3+ defense. Come in a regiment or a horde only, so no troops of those dudes. Unit strength 3 and 4 respectively. 12 attacks on the regiment, 25 on the horde. 13, 15 nerve on the regiment for 105 points. 20, 22 nerve on the horde for 175. So much the same stat line wise as the shield wall, but they've also got crushing strength 1, and they've got the Indomitable Will option as well.
So it's almost like exchanging the shield for a two-handed weapon.
That's
yeah, exactly.
it.
It almost doesn't need to be a separate unit, doesn't it, in a way? But
I guess you just can't take a troop.
You can't take a troop, yeah. For whatever reason. I don't know if that's a balancing thing, a decision that's been made. But yeah, I really rate these guys. I think they're excellent. Going down from defense 4 to 3 for crushing strength 1 is, broadly speaking, worth it, in my opinion. They're only 5 points more than 5 points more in the regiment, 10 points more in the horde than the equivalent. So, you do pay a extra cost, but it's a very small extra cost. And I do think it's worth it. It makes them a lot more of a threat just in general. And a lot of the times you find that the things that will come in and kill you when you're defense 4 will kill you just as easily at defense 3. It's really only small arms fire and things like that, like many attacks with no crushing, that the defense 3, that you really feel the defense 3. And that, depending on your area, I suppose, but I feel like that's not really the meta. Like heaps of archers or heaps of berserker kind of infantry and things like that are not necessarily the meta, but against like a monster or a war machine or any myriad of other things, they're exactly as tough as the shield wall, but they also can just punch back quite a bit harder.
Yeah, the biggest change between 2nd edition and 3rd edition is that there's no longer the troop. I know that the troop size used to be the go-to for chaff, as they were crushing one, they were cheap. Still a handy unit, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, interesting choice.
In both sizes?
Yeah, I think in both sizes. Yep, both sizes are good.
Yeah, I'm a little bit on the fence with the hordes. I just think that you can get better options in the hordes, but we can discuss those later.
And I think they're the best horde in the book, so the best horde in the.
I think they're pretty good
in the list. Yeah,
I think the regiments just doesn't have the nerve or the amount of attacks with reliable hitting power to be too much of a threat. I mean, it's only 105 points.
Yeah,
I'd probably want to give Indomitable Will.
I think the regiment's good for cheap unlocks. When you're saying that the cheapest unlock is the shield wall at 100 points, absolutely correct. I'd rather pay 5 points more and have a unit that actually threatens a flank in a bit more of a meaningful way and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Although if you're sitting on the backfield objective for those points, I actually think there's better options, so we'll get on to that later. But I think if you want a regiment that unlocks but also moves up and like threatens to some small degree, take the polearms over the shield wall.
All right, well, next up we've got the Spear Phalanx. Now, they're an infantry unit here as well, so speed 5, melee 4+, no range, defense 4. They come in regiments and hordes as well, unit strength 3 and 4 respectively. Attacks for the regiment is 15 and 30 for the horde. And the nerve is 13-15 and 20-22. And the points, 120 and 200. Now, they come with a couple of really juicy options. So the special rule across the board is Phalanx. They do come also with Indomitable Will for 10 points, and they can exchange those short spiky spears for long pikey pikes, and they get Ensnare for 20 points for the regiment and 30 points for the horde. I love these guys with Ensnare and the pikes.
In what size?
In the horde. I tried them actually out in the regiment last week, just without Indomitable Will, but with the pikes and Ensnare, and they do a job there as well, so... for 140 points, you can get a unit that's pretty much shuts down all cav, which is pretty impressive.
Absolutely, yeah. I think they're good in both. I'm still a proponent to a degree for like the cheap regiments of spears. A lot of people, it's not really their flavour, but I think they're great. Because their footprint's quite small. They're really nice at guarding a flank where you tend to see spears. While as your horde, you could also put the horde on the flank. Nothing wrong with that. But they're a really good centre holder with Ensnare, aren't they, as in a horde? Because just like at that point, it doesn't really matter what you are. If you're, heaven forbid, you're a large cavalry or a flyer or something, you're just basically stuffed. You're not going to do anything meaningful with charging them in the front. But even if you're not, just straight up Ensnare, defense 4 and 20-22 nerve will hold against almost anything. More often than not, 2 units of almost anything, you know? Unless it's like 2 units of whites or something like... uber destructive, they'll just hold no matter what, which is really reliable.
So what I found in my sort of test games that I played with is that the regiments, nobody seemed to charge them. They weren't really a threat, so nobody felt that they had to kill them, but at the same time it wasn't an easy kill, so nobody did. And it comes to turn 5 and 6, and everyone then starts to really focus on them, but by then all you have to do is make sure that they're in the front, and it's not a guaranteed kill.
Yeah, I could see a unit on a flank without Ensnare and with Indomitable Will as well. I think that could be an option. Not sure if it's the best one, but for 130 points at that point, you've got a unit that hopefully self-inspires on the important turn and can be quite independent of the rest of your army and just put your opponent in a position where when they're trying to get around that flank with their regiment of knights, or their 2 regiments of knights or whatever anyway, especially if you can sneakily hide them in the forest or something, then... they're kind of stuck. Like, you can't just ignore them and move past them because then they'll flank you and annoy you. And you can't really go into them either with any kind of ability to take them off in one turn.
Oh, definitely not. Not with Phalanx. If in that scenario where you've got the Knights, they're going to be at neg 2 to hit no Thunderous.
Yeah.
Oh, if they had Ensnare, yeah.
Yeah, or even if they don't have Ensnare and you can manage to hinder them or something because for some crazy reason they don't have the potion of the caterpillar. You know, what's his name? Macquar's taken the day off and just like closed his stall for the day, and for once knights actually suffer from some sort of terrain penalty. If in that event, then they're even more in trouble, obviously. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next infantry unit, the Foot Guard. So these are the more elite manly men's. Speed 5 is the same as everyone else, but they're melee 3, the first melee 3 unit. No ranged and defense 5. So best melee, best defense so far. Troops, regiments, and hordes on this one. Your troops, unit strength 110 attacks, 10, 12 nerve at 90 points. Regiments, the unit strength 3, 12 attacks, which is standard, 14, 16 nerve at 135. And the horde is the unit strength 4, 25 attack, 21, 23 nerve at 225 points. No special rules with these, so they're just flat.
Mm-hmm.
But you can give them Indomitable Will or exchange their their shields for bigger weapons, lowering their defense to 4 and giving them Crushing 1.
Mm-hmm.
And that's free, which I think is a great choice.
Yep, same.
Hitting on 3s, Crushing 1.
Yeah, defense 5 is awesome, but yeah, I'd be tempted to get that Crush 1 as well. If you've got a bunch of attacks on 3s, you want to make them actually do something when they connect.
Yep. Give them Brew of Strength or Bane Chant, and then you've got a serious threat.
Yeah, although if you've got Bane Chant floating about, I would not fault you for taking Brew of Strength and leaving them at defense 5. That way you've got a very tough, especially if you've got a horde, you get a very tough horde that's still hitting back very hard, especially when they're Bane Chanted. But they're also tough as nails at that point.
Mm. And I've used it like that, and I've found they've worked really well, keeping them defense 5 with the strength and possible Bane Chant.
Yeah, I've actually played this unit a lot with the hordes, and I take the extra Crushing 1 strength. I give them either Vicious or Elite, just to make sure that I can guarantee some more hits, and then I Bane Chant them for the extra Crushing. And so at that point, you've got an Elite melee 3+ unit with Crushing strength 2. In our meta, there's a lot of defense 5 and a lot of defense 6.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I've always found is that I struggle at taking off those bigger units. So this unit here is really, really handy to make quick works of the stone columns, etc.
And I tend to not take them because they're too expensive. So there you go. It's a different preference for different people. You can hear Sellick, the elf player. He likes his phalanx mans with all the upgrades and foot guard mans with all the upgrades. And I'm like, polearm block, man. Just get heaps of polearms. Don't give them Indomitable Will and just go nuts.
I also found, I've used it once, putting Brew of Sharpness on them, on the horde. And lowering their defense, so they got CS built in, so that's 25 attack hitting on 2s with Crushing 1 is very effective.
Yeah,
massive conversions.
And because of the higher nerve with Indomitable Will, it's hard to take off.
Yeah, even against a defense 4 unit or something like that, you're looking at a good approaching 20 damage. 2s to hit. That's crazy.
And then when you've got a mage sitting about with the ability to Bane Chant as well, just in case you hit something harder. Good nutcracker, that fella.
Yeah, it's a great unit. I tend to only use it in the hordes. I'm not sure about the regiments and the troops, just given that at the troop level, it's probably still going to die just as easy as the other ones. But it's more expensive. So in this list, you can really get good value for your points.
Yeah, they're basic. Look, let's be
Horde
honest.
seems a sweet spot.
They're just shock troops with with less attacks and better to hit roll. So they're basically shock troops. Yeah, shock troops are good, so take them.
All right, Huw, why don't you tell us about the militia mob?
The militia mob are pretty right on. They're speed 5 bros with 5+ melee and defense 3, so they're total potatoes. They come in a regiment, horde, or legion. Unit strength 2, 3, and 4 respectively. 12 attacks, 25 and 30. 11, 14 nerve on the regiment for your 70 points. 18 and 21 nerve on the horde for 115. And 24/27 on the Legion for 170 points. So cheap. They're crapola, of course, as you'd expect for their price point. But I honestly think that all of these sizes are kind of reasonable. I don't think I'd take a Legion very often, despite their obscene nerve of 24/27, just because they're an enormous footprint. And 170 points, like...
It's 50. Yeah, it's 55 points more just for a nerve bump.
Yeah, pretty
I mean,
much.
Sure, 5 extra attacks, but like
30 attacks.
life.
Who cares when you're hitting on 5s? Like, yeah, that's not a meaningful change. You're right. It's it's a lot. It's 6 extra nerve though. That's a
Not
lot.
6, yeah.
It's a lot of nerve. But for me, Regiment. This is one of your... What I find interesting about Kingdoms of Men, as I was talking to Sellick about this before the cast, actually, that I like that they have quite a few different chaff options, and they're all kind of different depending on the army and how you want to fit it in. They don't just have like an obvious choice like gargoyles. They're just like, oh, we've got gargoyles, so we'll just take heaps of gargoyles. You know, they've got sort of 5 different units that can fill that kind of chaff role, and it depends on your play style and your army style that might want to take them. So yeah, it depends on your army style as to which one you choose. And this one is probably my favourite, although again I'm a bit torn between a few. But the Regiment, 70 points, unit strength 2, 11, 14 nerve. Unlike your 75-point troop of shield wall pelicans with Indomitable Will, if you roll that 11 on the nerve, they're just wavered. And who cares if they're wavered? They've got 3 extra
I
nerves.
care that they're wavered. When I've got a regiment holding up my entire army because it's a bigger footprint, it's harder to get around them. Defense 3 and that larger waiver gap, it's much more likely to ruin my plans.
Yeah, I don't think there's so much move forward chaff. They're stand on the objective at the back and let your opponents move up. You can move them forward, of course, and they can get in the way sometimes, but with only speed 5 and no way of reliably getting in the way, and I'd just rather have them sit around and possibly take 2 units to take off, just because 2 turns to take off, just because of that 14 nerve. It's enough to not be easily removed in 1 turn by a flying character or such like, so they can hold
for
that
that
backline
role,
objective reliably.
Yeah, that works well, but then it's not really chaff because you're not throwing them away.
Yeah, I don't mind the regiment as well, Hugh. That they're one of my go-to chaff units, because out of all of the chaff units and the chaff options that we discuss, 70 points, 11, 14, and unit strength 2, and that's the critical bit. So when they slowly come up behind everything, they're a low priority unit because they can't punch, but unit strength 2, really good for objectives.
Yeah, I think of all the chaff units that are defensible, you've got, you know, your militia mob regiment, your shield wall troop, fanatics troop, which we'll get to, and archer troop, which we'll get to. And I think it depends on how much shooting your opponent has. If you expect them to take that sort of anti-chaff light shooting a fair bit, then I think that the militia mob you can't go past, just because of the really high nerve for the points. Like 14 nerve for 70 points is crazy. Like, it's so high. It really is for that amount of points. And yeah, they'll waver every now and again, but who cares? It depends on exactly what they're doing. If they're in the way of your army, I agree that sucks that they waver. In which case, you'll feel like a real goose with your shield wall with Indomitable Will when you give them fearless, and then they, yeah, at least they'll get away with it.
You've nailed it on the head there, Hugh. So when I've used these units as chaff, you have to say the good objective is for them to hold. And when they can hold or waver, it's the counter charge from something else that's going to do the damage. Definitely not this unit with its melee 5+, just waving like fish everywhere. But yeah, at 11-14, assume they're going to waver, and if they break, then that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's it. And then you're like, oh, boo-hoo, 70 points. So I think you need to compare them in a way, even though they're a completely different unit, to Fanatics.
Which are next. So they are Speed 5, Melee 3, No Range, Defense 3. They come in Troops, Regiments and Hordes. Unit Strength 1, 3 and 4. Attacks 12, 15 and 30. They're fearless, so their nerves are -11, -15 and -22. The points are at 95, 145 and 240. They come with 2 special rules. The first is Crushing Strength 1 and Wild Charge D3. What do we think?
Great. Troops are much better than regiments. I haven't really tried the horde because I'd rather have the foot guard as a horde with the crushing strength than a fanatic, just because of that defense bump.
Yeah, I think when you look at the foot guard horde with the defense bump, with the crushing 1 and defense 4, I should say, that's 225 on the horde, and the fanatics are 240. For 21-23 nerve versus -22. But then, yeah, defense 4 instead of 3 definitely matters against small arms fire and stuff. The reason the Fanatics are a bit more expensive is they do have those 30 attacks and wild charge. So they're more aggro, they're more offensive. And I think that comes down to how... This again, similar to the Militia Mob and the Foot Guard, it depends how much shooting your opponent is going to take. If it's not much shooting, if you're playing Undead all the time or something, then maybe you just take Fanatics instead of Foot Guard, maybe. Because you're never getting much range damage against you, so the defense isn't hurting you as much. You're playing a lot of like high crushing and that kind of thing. Just take the extra attacks and the extra threat range to try to, outpace their infantry and get the charge most of the time. On the other hand, if you're playing heaps of elves, then you should be taking the Foot Guard because they're going to outpace you anyway in many instances, and the Foot Guard can hold up against a bit of small arms fire a bit better.
I don't think the wild charge is as effective on the Horde, just because it's harder to maneuver around, which is why I prefer the troops. It's a little small unit that can do a lot of damage and is quite zippy because of the small footprint.
Yeah, so the Fanatic troops are one of my favourite chaff units in this list.
Yeah,
purely
the best.
Yeah, purely because they're a unit that can't be ignored. So they've got 12 attacks, hitting on 3s. So that means that on a defense 5 unit, they're knucking down. Knucking?
They're knocking down.
Hell, I'm going to go with it. They're knucking down with 4 wounds a turn.
It's a Kingdom of Men thing.
You guys wouldn't know. But what I love about them is you have to deal with them or you're taking that 4 wounds. They've got that D3 wild charge, which means that you can't predict exactly how long they can charge, like all of that Russian
11
standoffs.
to 13 is pretty good range for a troop.
And because you can't ignore it, if it gets in your flank, that's like 24 attacks hitting on 3s with Crushing Strength 1. Yeah. And that all of a sudden is like something to fear.
Even the 4 wounds you're purporting there, that's charging a defense 5 unit in the front.
Yeah, that's right.
If you're lower defense, obviously you're getting up to 5-6 wounds. And that's crazy for a troop, even at 95 points. Yeah, really a nice offensive output, and that extra projected threat on your infantry line, if you've got sort of an infantry walk it forward kind of army, is pretty right on. However, again, I know I'm probably starting to sound a bit like I'm harping onto it now, but if your opponent takes a bit of small arms fire, if your opponent plays armies like I do that are proper mixed arms, fun to play kind of armies that aren't just all sort of one particular cookie cutter kind of space, and they've got like a smattering shooting about the place, a militia mob for 25 points less that takes sort of 4 wounds from like a little bit of shooting here and there, which seems pretty reasonable. You roll a 7 on the nerve, the average roll, and they're wavered. Yeah, bummer. But on the Fanatics, they're dead. And they cost you 25 more points. Same defense of 3. Very easy to just pop a few wounds on them. You're right, you can't ignore them. But when you don't ignore them, they're dead.
Yeah, but also in that example, your militia mob probably won't get shot because they're sitting in the back, so they're probably going to get cover as well. The Fanatics are going to be up front because they're doing things.
Well, yeah, they could be, but also if you're sitting in the back getting an objective, then they're doing their job anyway at that price point. Yeah. But if you are moving them up, like even in the scenario where you've got a line of infantry blokes and they're all moving up together, whether you got that militia mob standing in that same spot or the Fanatics, it's one thing to say, yeah, they waver easily, but then the Fanatics die easily, so...
Yeah, I think very different roles. So you got your militia mobs that is moving up or staying still with its unit strength 2 to occupy the objectives, okay? And I think that nerve for the points is just exceptional. I think the Fanatics in the troops are really about, all right, I'm going to get in your face, you have to deal with me, or else I'm going to put down those 4 wounds, as I mentioned, into your defense 5, and then you're going to have to countercharge me, and it's that really making sure that you get the right charge. That's what their job is. So I think very different. You would never put your militia mob slowly coming up in the middle of the board to try and get in the way, because they will waver because of their high nerve.
And they're so slow, because there's no wild charge, so that you have to get quite close if you want to do anything with them.
Yeah, you can... Por qué no los dos? Like, why not use both, man? Like, they both have a cool little role in the army. And the other thing you can use these kinds of units for, so I see this a lot with Morax and Morax troops and your half-elf troops as well, is that you can have them sort of floating around behind your main line as you move them up, and then they can sort of reach out surprisingly far, sometimes with that D3 extra charge, if you can get line of sight on a larger unit and combo charge things. This is sort of, if you're playing an army that's got a bit of shooting, say you're playing a few different regiments of archers or things like that, and long rifles in a troop or what have you, maybe a war machine or two. Popping them behind your troops to protect them a bit can be useful, and then hopefully they can charge at the same time in many instances. And they can protect against units like dragons. So if you've got dragons flying behind your army, and you're a sort of fairly offensive Kingdoms of Men army that doesn't have a whole heap of war machines to try to shoot at them or things like that, this little troop is not a bad option because they can threaten even dragons. Like, as you say, they're 4 wounds or 8 wounds in the flank of a dragon. You can't afford to land a dragon behind them if you've got a little troop of fanatics on an angle behind their army. You've almost removed the option of that dragon landing behind your lines.
Yep.
One thing that we forgot to mention is that the militia mob are an irregular unit, so their regiments or any size are not unlocking things. But you shouldn't have a problem unlocking with the rest of the choices in the list.
Yeah, it's a very
correct.
good point. It really it makes their regiment and horde significantly less attractive, though, if you're looking for your unlocks.
Okay, so let's get onto the ranged infantry. There's only a couple of choices here. So we got the bowmen. So they are speed 5, melee 5, ranged 5, defense 3, come in troop, regiment, and hordes. Standard unit strength there, hordes unit strength 3, because ranged. Regiments unit strength 2, troops unit strength 1, 8 attacks, 9, 11 nerve, 75 points. Regiments 10 attacks, 13, 15 nerve at 100. And the hordes 20 attacks at 20, 22 nerve for 175. And they've just got 24-inch bows. That's all they're equipped with.
Yeah, I think forget about the horde. It's a bit of a waste of time, in my opinion. Only unit strength 3, 25s to hit attacks with no crushing at 24 is not particularly
no piercing.
useful. However, if you've got that backline regiment troop that we were saying the militia regiment is a good option for, and you've got a spare 30 points going from 70 to 100, they're the same defensively. Or actually, I lie, they're slightly better. They're 13, 15. They won't waver as easily.
Yeah.
But they can crack out a handful of shots every turn, and that's really useful, having the backline objective holder that also cracks out a few shots. And likewise, the troop is another really handy little chaff piece because they can also hold an objective at the back and crack out a few shots at a very cheap price point. But if your opponent has shooting and they sort of, send something in their general direction, then they're going to die just as easily as the fanatics. So, yeah.
What I found is the bowman troop are an excellent choice for just sitting there, holding an objective, holding a section of the board, holding whatever. You're not sending them forward at all. And yes, they might get taken off in 1 or 2 rounds of lightning bolt, but they're never getting hit because you have fanatics and other small troops which are much more threatening. So these guys they fly under the radar so well. They've only got 8 attacks hitting on 5s, but they're still going to do 1 or 2 wounds a turn, and they're probably surviving to the end because they're not being threatened at all because they're not threatening. And at the end of the game, when things have lots of wounds on them and are more likely to get taken off with 1 or 2 wounds from a ranged shot, this is where they excel.
Absolutely agree. Kingdoms of Mans have quite a lot of relatively cheap units, so they tend to be very threat dense. And for that reason, you're absolutely right. It's unlikely that your opponent is going to have enough resources to sling a few shots the way of the cheapest chips bowman. Unless, of course, that objective that they're holding is really critical to their plans, in which case, goodbye the bowman. But then in that instance, you're right. A lot of the time, they'll just as easily take off a regiment of militia or something. So it sort of depends on what your opponent's got to a degree. But you might think 8 shots at 5+ to hit, crushing nothing, will never kill anything. And to a degree, that's correct. On its own, it won't. But what it will do is very, very often, it will do, like the vast majority of the time you shoot them, it'll do A damage, which is enough to cause that nerve roll. And sometimes that's all you need, especially after you've double won the unit or just put a heap of damage on them or something and they haven't fled. And then you just go, just ping 1 damage on them and take it off. And if you do that once in every other game with a troop of bowmen, you're thinking this is the best 75 points I ever spent at that point.
Yeah, like a troop of fanatics goes into a regiment, does 7 or 8 damage, they get countercharged, maybe die. And so that regiment that the fanatics damaged is sitting there and they need, 6 or 7 to roll to take them off. So you take the bowman troop, aim at them, maybe get 1 or 2 damage, and now you need a 4 or 5
Yeah, that's it. Or even the cheeky, like they've got a unit of gargoyles. You do 1 or 2 damage with your bowmen. They're unhurt.
Yeah.
And then you just spike 1 good nerve roll and off they go. You
Yeah.
know, and you're like, it doesn't happen every time they fire, but when it does happen, even if it's like 1 in 10 times they fire, you've spent such a small investment on that unit. So they're fantastic.
And if you manage to get them on a hill, even better, because they hit in combat just as well as they shoot. So if you can, towards the end of the game, and then they're getting a bit closer, you charge them off the hill, now you're getting Thunderous Charge. And much more likely to do 2 or 3 points of damage instead.
But why not spend very slightly more and take a crossbow block, who are speed 5, melee 5, range 5, defense 3, same dealio there, in a troop, regiment or horde, unit strength 1, 2, and 3, so that 1 lower unit strength that we're used to seeing at this point for shooting units. Their attacks are 8, 10, and 20, which is the same as the archers, 9, 11, 13, 15, 20, and 22 on the nerves, respectively, which again is the same as the archers. 85 points, 115, and 200. So it's quite a significant leap. It's 10 points more than the archers on a troop, 15 more on the regiment, and 25 more on the horde. And what do they have? Pierce 1 and pot shot. So crossbows are 24, same as archers, but they also have Pierce 1, basically.
You can also give them rifles instead, which gives them Pierce 2 for 10, 15, or 25 points for the horde. But yeah, I think the pot shot is the difference here, because towards the end of the game, you need to be able to turn and shoot something. And if you've got pot shot, then there's no chance of hitting. Well, I guess there is, but there's not.
Yeah, I'd see it totally differently, Bensome. So the difference between what you guys were just discussing and while I was nice and quiet back here is troops coming in with the bowmen. So they've got 8 attacks with no piercing at all. I know, once again, Math Hammer doesn't work, but that's less than 1 as a percentage as a wound against defense 5. And I think if you go the crossbow block in the troops with the upgrade, yeah, you're paying an extra 20 points more. So it goes to 95 points, but you are putting out, I think it's 2 wounds almost with the ability to spike either way naturally. And I think that's a more reliable unit.
It certainly is, but now you've just increased their threat, and their the target on their head is just increased dramatically.
That's true. I think both are valid.
If I've got my opponent's got a little troop there that is reliably putting out points of damage, then that's something that I'm aiming with lightning bolt or fireball or just a cheap flying character. With a bowman, which has a potential to do not very much at all, that threat is not there. And that's the point, keeping them alive to the end so they're doing their job.
Yeah, it depends on your points, I think, as well, right? Like, this is the kinds of units that you add toward the end of your army. I don't think that either is invalid. Even the crossbows, the in-between the two, as opposed to the handguns versus bows, it's like, what points have you got left at the end of your army when you've got those last sort of few slots? If you've got a unit of bowmen floating about and you've got 10 points spare, probably making them a crossbow is troop as opposed to a bowman troop, or the crossbows to the handguns is likely to be better than putting 10 points worth of magic items on something else, because it is a reasonable little reward for that low investment. I agree with you there, Sellick. But yeah, it's sort of, you're talking about a very cheap chaff unit as well, and you're trying to keep them as cheap as possible. 20 points is like almost 30% of their cost increase. It is quite a large bump when you're talking about such a cheap unit as well.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at it purely on my experiences playing, and high defense is what you struggle with in this list. And in your scenario, Bensome, you are 100% correct. They are a pretty tasty target for a lightning bolt that can potentially knock them out, right? But I guess depending upon how you build your list and how you want to play, that's not always a negative thing. If they're using lightning bolts against a crossbow block, they're not using it against your fast characters on Pegasuses. And I think that's where you've sort of got to have a look at it, because if they're targeting that tiny unit that's got ability to create a threat, then that's okay. But what I've found is they generally don't, and they sit there until turn 5 as well.
So what does pot shot do again? Is that's just always hit on 6s?
No. So when you move, it's neg 2.
So instead of neg 1, it's neg 2.
So instead of going to 6s, you go to
7s, which is half your attacks on 6s.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. So they can't rotate and shoot as effectively as the bows, basically.
Yep.
But then if you're rotating, if you're at negative anything, because what we're doing, which is a bit of a fallacy, and I think this is probably an important thing to bring up with it when it's talking about these kinds of shooting units, is that when you're range 5, which of course most of them are, you have to expect to be hitting on 6s a lot of the time. So a bit of the math that we've just given out from Sellick and I, it kind of falls over a bit when you go to hitting on 6s, especially with 8 attacks, where on average you get 1 hit, but a lot of the time you'll get 0 hits. And -1 is very frequently going to be the case, whether it's stealthy, cover, they've moved, whatever the reason is. So for that reason, you shouldn't be expecting to hit on 5s all the time. And I actually think that detracts a little bit from the handgunner troop, because if you're paying 95 points for something that just, you're against Night Stalkers, or there's a lot of terrain, or you find you have to move to an objective, or whatever the reason is, you're just not hitting like really ever in a game, then you've spent 20 points for no reason at that point. So
deployment is 100% critical for this.
Turns and roundabouts.
So just making sure that you've got the right table side and the right sort of firing range, for sure.
And if you have to move to an objective, if it's like midfield or something, and you have to move up there with your troop, which I've done with a few troops of bowmen a couple of times, being able to crack out a few shots on 6s is okay. But I mean, handguns or crossbows are shooting 4 shots on a 6 on a troop if you actually move.
Yeah. If you're paying the points to upgrade, so you're sitting at around the 100-point mark, now you should just be looking at mounted scouts, which we'll get into shortly.
Maybe, although, again, they do have a completely different role, don't they? Because that's like a forward chaff unit versus a rear guard kind of unit.
Yeah, but you can use them in the same capacity. I mean, the range is slightly shorter, but they're steady aim and have the ability to move.
True.
No, I've just got one more thing, and then I'll shut up about Math Hammer. But if you are shooting at 6s with 8 attacks with no crushings, no piercing, it's exactly the same as half attacks with piercing 2.
If you're shooting, defense 5?
Yep, yeah, defense 5.
Not everything's defense 5 though, and the things you're shooting at with a bow are not usually defense 5. You're shooting like gargoyles and other bowmen and nonsense like that a lot.
Well, naturally that's going to scale on both sides. So, but it's just as a hypothetical to throw it out there for the listeners.
Right on.
Yeah, just listen to me. It's all right. Okay, so we'll have a break, and when we come back, we'll discuss the things on 4 legs.
With the High Council of Primavontor dead and much of the land laid waste, the shock of the inundation after the war with winter was the final blow to the tottering republic. The remnants of it broke up into warring statelets, and much was forgotten. Beyond Basileia, dozens of independent city-states now rule small kingdoms all over the peninsula of Primavantia, known as the Successor Kingdoms, and to the north and west of the Dragon's Teeth Mountains, known as the Young Kingdoms. Perhaps the greatest of all the Successor Kingdoms is Valentica, which occupies the entirety of the lands bearing the same name. The city of Valentica itself sits on the edge of Lake Harrowmere, at the source of the mighty river Valen, which meanders its way south to empty into the endless sea at the great estuary of Emphotia. Great docks line the water's edge, with piers and jetties thrusting out welcoming arms for traders to load and unload their exotic wares.
And welcome back. Alright guys, we're going to be taking on the Cavalry next. They've got 3 options, and the first is going to be the Knights. So they've got speed 8, melee 3, no ranged, defense 5, they come in troops, regiment and a massive horde, unit strength 1, 3 and 4, attacks 8, 16 and 32, nerve 11, 13, 14, 16 and 21, 23, the points 125, 195 and 330. Special rules, headstrong, great rule, and thunderous charge 2, and these guys can also take the indomitable will for 10 points. At height 3. Yeah, good stuff.
Alright, so what do we think about each of these sizes?
I've played them all. They're a pretty handy unit. I played the troops. They were actually surprisingly good. While a little bit more expensive, they are more of a flanking unit. Regiment's probably my go-to, even though they are pretty expensive compared to the rest of the list for what you get. The Horde, man, it cops a punch, and it's hard to take off, but I just think for 330 points, 21, 23...
350 points.
330,
No, 330.
No, they have
Yeah,
the potion of the caterpillar bolted on.
Oh, that's right. So at 350 points, I just found them to be actually weirdly fragile. In that after the initial charge, they just get ganged up on pretty quickly because it's a massive threat.
Yeah, that's when you're paying that much for a hammer unit, and there's very few in King's War that are that expensive. That's like up there with the most expensive units possible.
Top tier price point.
Yeah, especially when you've got such a whopping footprint. Once you hit something and take it off, it's going to be less points than you, so you've killed it. And then you're likely to get countercharged by like multiple units because you're such a large footprint, and no matter how you rotate, the reality on the board can sometimes be a bit different to how it looks in paper. And I agree with you, Sellick. I think the Horde is cool and it can be effective, especially since probably the whole rest of your army like revolves around getting that Horde to work, I suspect. You kind of need it to. If you just chuck it in an army list, you'll find it more often than not goes into one thing, hopefully kills it. Heaven forbid you fluff the dice and like roll double ones or something, but then they're even more potato. But yeah, if you do go through a unit, then you're probably going to get creamed afterwards.
Yeah, the Horde size is definitely the highest skill cap unit to use. So if you're not very confident, don't take it. You're just wasting points there. So stick with a regiment or two. Much easier to work with. I like the Horde, but you do need to kind of set it up to protect it and engineer the correct charge or charges towards the end of the game. Definitely don't fang this thing out in the first 2 turns because they'll just get taken out. They'll be disordered, and then they're just flailing with 32 attacks. Yeah, you'll hit whatever coming back, but it's much more likely that you're going to get countercharged by 2 or 3 units and they're gone.
That's right. Also, if you lose your Thunderous for whatever reason, 32 attacks on 3s. No, it's still nasty-ish, but
It's
especially if
still a
they've
one
got a
dice, yeah.
decent defense, you might not hit as hard as you expect. They're not going to just continue to kick goals in persistent rounds of combat necessarily.
Yeah. They'll only do a handful of wounds as opposed to a bucket load.
Yeah, as opposed to an amount which puts any unit in the game on double ones, which is what they do on the charge, what they should do anyway, with even reasonably sensible rolls. I mean, Math Hammer aside, when you've got 32 attacks, that's just so much mud at a wall on 3s that you should be doing okay. But
Unless playing UB.
Unless you're playing UB, when the dice sometimes just do silly things to you. Yeah, no,
21 ones, what?
I rate the regiment. I don't really rate the troop. The Horde can be good, but for reasons described, not necessarily so hot. The main reason I don't rate the troop that much is just that for 125 points, there's quite a few other troops in the list, some of which we've already covered and some we're about to. That
it's a bit of a weird spot, that one.
Yeah, they just feel like they fit that role a little bit better at less points. So, like the Thunderous 2 is that they so heavily rely on is a really big deal. Like, don't for new players out there. Like, if you play players that are quite competent, or you intend to, or you whatever, like you anticipate playing players that aren't total pelicans in the future, which is probably all of us. Just forget about taking regiments of these guys without either the caterpillar or the boots of striding.
Jesse's boots.
Boots. Like
and make sure
put it on every time.
Make sure you got a mounted wizard with Bane Chant and the conjuring staff to make sure that when these guys do get disordered, at least they've got some sort of defense penetrating ability.
Yeah, like you imagine it in your head, like you're going to charge in on the flank, you're going to kill a thing, you're going to rotate, you can get to charge again or whatever, and you're going to get that Thunderous a lot of the time. The reality is, especially if you don't ignore the terrain, if you don't ignore terrain, you'll just about never get you'll be Thunderous 1, and you're just such a weaker unit at that point. Forced to hit Thunderous 1 is not impressive for the price point you're paying for them. So you need to be ignoring that terrain. And then even once you are, you got to expect that sometimes, especially on the regiment, you're going to get hit with something faster than you, or you're going to get you're going to fluff the charge and have to fight a subsequent round of combat or whatever. And that once that Thunderous goes, these guys just kind of feel like they have, swords made out of foam that are sort of not doing that well.
Yep. Bensome, you've sort of stolen my thunder there a little bit.
Thanks. You've been disordered.
There we go. Oh no, Kings of War jokes.
Yeah.
But the necessity, particularly if you are taking the Horde, I think that flying wizard on Pegasus with Bane Chant is almost the mandatory.
Indomitable Will every time, you reckon?
Yep.
Yep.
It's 10 points. It's interesting that Indomitable Will doesn't scale for the size of the unit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So 330, well 350 because Caterpillar version.
Yep.
10 points. It's in for a penny, in for a pound.
I don't think
Makes it fearless. Yeah.
you're absolutely right. I don't think the army-wide rules ever do scale for sizes. I could be wrong.
One special rule though that they do have Headstrong is massive. So on a 3-up, they can ignore waivers. And just become disordered, I think. So
Yeah, they're like borderline fearless at that point, aren't they? Because you've got Indomitable Will to just ignore a waiver straight up if you want to, and Headstrong in that turn that you get wavered and you already used your Indomitable Will or something. Like, are you gonna make that roll rather than just use Indomitable Will? Maybe you've already used it.
Yeah, you want to guarantee it. You don't want to risk it.
I wouldn't be risking the 3+. That's right. If I hadn't popped it yet, but maybe I've moved them up turn 1 and popped Indomitable Will. Maybe I've popped that chisel right away just to make sure that they're inspired and don't get taken off because they're key to my battle plan or something, and then they get wavered. I could see that.
If they have decided to fling out front and are not inspired, you're popping it just in case.
I find it's a good second layer. So after you have used the Indomitable Will on that first charge, or the second charge or the counter charge or whatever, and then it's late turn 5, you've taken a few wounds, somebody rolls that waiver, just having that Headstrong there is bloody handy.
It's still butt clenching when you have to roll it.
Oh yeah, and without a doubt I roll it too, but that's alright.
They're more or less fearless, I mean, except for if you Sellick on turn 5. But I mean, just put I prefer Caterpillar to Boots of Striding personally, but it's sort of a flavour feel, whatever you prefer.
It's just so you can at the double through terrain when you can't do that with J-Boots.
That's right. I like to be able to do that. And it's also that like sometimes you do charge with the J-Boots and then find that you're still in terrain at a later turn and need to charge again. And they are one use. So for 5 extra points, I'm on those ones. So then you've got a 225 point regiment, which is on the high side, but it is really quite a reliable, useful threat at that point. And that's how I'd take them. I'd just forget about them the rest of the time. Some people love like multiple regiments of them, just having a mad horde of knights. But
yeah, 2 regiments I think is effective. It gives you more things to charge at, and if they're both charging at the one target, then it's the same as a horde. But you do pay a bit more for having 2 regiments. But then you got 2 units that are also unlocking, and it's 6 unit strength as opposed to 4. So
yeah, for your chargy, punchy units, that's a good move. It's either that or a bunch of monsters, I think, if you want things that actually kill things in this list at a reasonable charge distance.
Yes. One last thing before we move on is that the Horde is such a large footprint. You can actually claim quite often 2 objective tokens or loot tokens at the same time towards the end of the game, because they're usually 12 inches apart. And the Horde is very long, and because you've got that little bit extra, because you have to be within 3 inches of an objective, they can claim 2 spots. So I found that with the Goblin Fleabag Rider Horde, towards the end, just moving, sitting down, or if you've got a loot token, you can kind of drop it, move, and then pick up another thing and keep the other one. So that's just a very niche sort of tactic there, but you can just keep that in mind that they can also claim multiple things at once.
Probably even more niche for these guys, just because if your horde of knights is still alive on turn 5 or 6, then you've probably won anyway, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to use them is to make sure you don't charge anything within the first 3 turns. You want to make sure that you're setting up the right charge and taking out their big thing. If you're fanging them out forward, it's
that's a good piece of advice.
They're going to
for
get cooked.
Yep. Okay, let's move on. How about we go to their Chaffee brothers, the Mounted Sergeants. So these are a speed 9 cavalry units, melee 4, no range, defense 4. Troop and regiments only. Unit strength 1, 7 attacks, 10, 12, 100 points for the troop, and the regiment's unit strength 3, 14 attacks, 13, 15 nerve at 150 points. These guys are nimble and thunderous charge 1 only. Troops are excellent chaff for your knights, because they keep up more so. You can sit them behind the horde if you want, fang them out a turn before the charge, just to make sure nothing charges the knights. I don't know about the regiment. I mean, hitting on 4s, it's only thunderous 1. I found these guys to sort of fluff their attacks because of the melee 4.
There's quite a few armies that have this type of unit. There's in the regiment size, you've got 150 points for fast speed.
These are
9.
human flea bags, basically.
They're human flea bags, or
Poor bastards.
yeah, or the rats riding rats, or there's a number of other units that are.
I'm
similar.
sure they're very noble. We're just calling them flea bags.
Yeah, flea bags. Thunderous 1 and 4s to hit. Bensome, you know that if any terrain is involved at all, they are not a threat, even on a flank with 28 attacks. If you're hitting on
Fives
and no
defense
thunderous,
piece.
forget about it. So I actually think a regiment with a potion of the caterpillar can be pretty cool. They are nimble. They can march into a forest that way. They can go at the double in a forest, rotate, and then still be a really nasty threat. And that particular move, which I talked about when we did the Ratkin review, can be tasty and unexpected for people. Because they've got that nimble, that makes it's a lot better at 170
Nimble's
points
great.
than the equivalent on a regiment of knights. Yes, they're less threatening on the charge or whatever, but they are that significant amount more maneuverable. You can just pull off some jank shit with those nimble charges. Listen to the episode of Sellick interviewing Brenton Williams if you want to listen
On
to
YouTube?
Yeah, on YouTube if you want to. On the Direct Misfire YouTube channel, definitely check that
We've
out.
got one. We've had one for a while.
Yeah.
Soon set it up.
We've had one for a while. Don't release content on it that often in the past, but Sellick's been stepping up the game there. If you guys haven't checked that out yet, it's a bit of a tangent, but man, it's pretty rad. Like all those, sweet pictures and animations and stuff you've been doing, Sellick.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Good job.
if you haven't fallen in love with Nimble after watching that, try a mounted sergeant's unit. I'm starting to like them. I'm talking myself into it. Take a regiment of these dudes and see what sneaky tricks you can pull off.
I personally prefer troops. Regiments just don't cut the mustard.
The troops are pretty much one of your only defenses against flyers. They don't quite get the speed, but most of the flyers are setting up to shut down your knights. And your mounted sergeants, particularly with that nimble, they can sort of get out of the line of sight with their massive move 9 and then use the pivot. And then after that, they can start to shut down. But they're only going to get like 1 or 2 wounds
You only
generally.
need the one if you're shutting
But
down.
that's it. That is exactly it. That's where I don't quite like the regiments. I think I sort of sit with yourself, Bensome, there. The 150 points, it's not really their purpose. There's probably still only going to get 2 to 3 wounds max.
I'm just going to clarify for any new people to Kings of War what we mean by shutting down. Because if you run into a flyer, do a damage, then that flyer loses fly and nimble, and they can't escape and kind of do the sneaky tactics and fly around and ruin your day. So that's what we mean when we say shutting down.
Yeah, we don't
Stopping
mean
us from doing
destroying
anything.
them. Yeah. Or against a unit with a lot of thunderous or something, or a shooting unit or whatever, getting them that disorder on them can shut them down in a different way. Yeah. So the last question I have about these guys is, if they're all sergeants, where are their privates?
Between their legs.
Really?
Usually. I don't know about... maybe there's some inbreeding and they've got them somewhere else, but yeah.
Drill sergeant.
Maybe the mounted scouts are the privates? I don't know. I think the mounted scouts are better than sergeants.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you got another speed 9 movement for range 5, defense 3 unit. So you lose a defense versus the sergeants, but of course you get that ranged weapon. It's unit strength 1 and 2, so the regiment doesn't get that unit strength 3 if that matters to you for whatever reason.
Otherwise, the rest of the stats are the same. It's just like 5 points more for the regiment. That's it.
Exactly. It's still 7 and 14 shots in this case, or attacks in combat. So you lose your thunderous, but then you get short bows, which is 18 inches, and you get steady aim as well. So nimble and steady aim, those shots are not exactly the most potent things in the world, but you certainly have all the tools to get those shots in the right target, I guess. Move up to 9, then have a pivot, and then shoot at full capacity. And in fact, if you give them an upgrade, which they've got, to give you short bows, turn it into black powder weapons, so they don't even say what kind of black powder weapons. I guess you can just give them
various blunderbuss.
Pistols, blunderbuss, rifle, whatever you feel like, a musket, whatever. They're still 18 inches, but they've got Pierce 1, and they retain their steady aim. So unlike the black powder on foot, which, you move, then you basically just don't hit anything, these guys can move, quite far and then still crack out a nice little volley, which is cool.
And I think that's the way to go, paying that little extra to make sure that you're actually doing some wounds, which is their role here. So unlike the bowmen and crossbowmen, where you're kind of hoping that they don't get hit and just putting on 1 or 2 damage. These guys can reliably put out a decent amount of wounds as the regiment if they've got the black powder weapons. And I found when I've been playing them, taking 2 regiments of these, so giving you 28 shots on 5s, yes, but yeah, piercing 1. You can usually take off a unit every 1 or 2 turns.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a lot of points, but it is pretty nasty. 180 points for that unit. That, you know, if you get shot back or charged by anything, you're in pretty deep trouble. But they are only defense 3 after all. But 180 points.
They are also speed 9 and nimble and sitting around the knights. So your opponent's thinking, all right, do I charge the mounted scouts? Or, which I would think, no, because you're hiding them well. Or charge the knights to try and disorder them. But then your sergeants are also trying to shut down any flyers. So there's a big cauldron of choice there. And I find the mounted scouts they're just low on the priority list and have this nimble speed to get away from anything threatening as well.
Maybe they shouldn't be so low on the priority list though. When you've got 14 Pierce 1 attacks, that's actually fairly nasty. It's one of those kind of in between, like not nothing, not super powerful, that you just plink away, don't you? You just add up that damage over time. And 8-inch range is not super far. Like definitely they have a bit of a weakness against flying monsters and that kind of thing. Yeah. Because they're a bit outranged by them and they can, you know, get put in a bit of a rock or a hard place situation. If your opponent just puts a dragon 19 inches away from them and you're like, well, do I move up and shoot him? Do I try to move back, whatever? But still, I actually kind of really like that unit too. Like they're very expensive, but they do seem like they could really dominate other chaff, destroy other chaff, and then like just help you win that mobility war if you dedicate enough points to it. Like you're talking about, Bensome, like the 2 reg of knights and 2 reg of these guys with handguns.
That's a lot of points on horses, but yeah, it's quite effective.
It is a hell of a lot of points, but that is going to win that kind of flank war against most armies, I would think.
Totally agree with everything you've said. They're a really handy unit, particularly the move and shoot with speed 9 is terrific. The biggest downfall, and Huw, you've already called it out, is that they are so vulnerable to flyers. Because their short bows or their black powder weapons are only 18 inches, they're always getting into range of a flyer or other people shooting at 24 inches. And with defense 3, even if you don't have piercing on your opposition, all of a sudden that 13-15 nerve for 180 points, I think it is, all of a sudden becomes really, really dangerous, I guess, or risky. So you have to use them very cautiously.
Yeah, you just got to be clever with your positioning.
You do. Most of Kingdoms of Men have reasonably low on the defense side of things and not necessarily the fastest cats in the world, notwithstanding mounted scouts. So you do have a bit of vulnerability to flyers overall in this list. So I think it is really worthwhile taking a few units that you can use to try to hit back against the flyers, or at least limit their ability to just run wild.
And just diverting back to that Sneaky Tactics YouTube video, give that a watch, and hopefully that'll give you some idea of how to protect these guys from flies.
So next up we finish off the cavalry and we jump into chariots. So they've only got one option here, and that's the charioteers. They are irregular, but they are speed 9, melee 4+, range 5+, defense 4+. They come in troops, regiments, hordes, and legions with unit strength 1, 2, 3, 4. I lied. I love that. The attacks come in at 8, 12, 16, and 20. The nerves 11, 13, 13, 15, 15, 17, and 19, 21. The points 125, 155, 195, and 225. All of the 5s. Special rules, I've got a couple. Thunderous Charge 2, and they also have the short bows. The attacks, however, don't mirror the attacks on the profile. So the attacks for the troops is 4, the regiments is 6, the hordes is 8, and the legion is 10.
Basically half their melee attacks.
That's right. And they also have steady aim.
It's a very satisfying unit to read, just because all the numbers are kind of sort of even, apart from like the unit size and the points sort of slightly. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the attacks is jumping up 4 each time, and the nerves is jumping up 2, 2.
Yeah, you can
Good.
you can definitely see the implication of the equation there. Just the fact that you've got a troop, regiment, horde, and legion. It's an amazingly versatile unit that has sort of all these different sizes and things. But what I think is a real bummer about these chariots is that they've been made irregular. And I think they're irregular because they shoot and like they feel very much like they've been plugged into.
It's a very
formula.
meager shooting ability. I don't think it's worth turning them irregular for that.
Definitely agree. I think they should not be irregular, and I think you'd see them a lot more if they were regular, if they did unlock, because they can fulfill like a similar role to the knights, and that little peppering of extra shooting attacks is really just icing on the cake. It's not like because they're weaker than the knights in a number of ways. Like they don't hit on a 3+ is the biggest one. And Thunderous 2 with their, depending on their size of unit you take, potentially really large footprint, means that, again, you're competing for those items to stop them from losing their Thunderous every time you bloody charge anything. Short bows, meh. You can't upgrade them to pistols or anything. I don't know.
And fewer attacks than the regiment of mounted scouts. I mean, I think the only sort of thing to consider here is if you were thinking about taking a troop of knights, perhaps consider taking the troop of chariots, because you've got the same amount of attacks, same amount of points. These guys get 4 shooting attacks. I mean, you're not hitting anything, but maybe. But the speed goes up to 9, and it's on a square footprint instead of a weird oblong. So if they do survive something, they can kind of back up, pivot 90, and fang off 9 and get away, where you can't really do that with knights.
Yeah, the troop is interesting. I've really seriously considered in the army list that I took when I was playing Kingdom's Men recently, really considered that last sort of flex slot in the army where I wasn't sure what I wanted for my last unit. I'm looking at this unit and going, oh yeah, the regiment looks kind of interesting. Oh, what about the horde? You know, it's quite difficult to decide, I find, but they're too sort of wishy-washy. They suffer from that same thing that so many other units do, where if you're trying to be a, generalist and master of nothing, then in almost every size here, including the troop, you're like, well, you got a troop of these guys. Do you want a troop of mounted sergeants or scouts instead? Probably. Yeah. In a regiment or a horde kind of size, do you want to take the knights instead? Even a legion, if you want to take a legion of chariots for whatever reason, for 225 points, it's only about as good as the regiment of knights. It's still only 20 attacks.
Just with a much bigger base size.
Why does a legion of chariots only have 20 attacks? I feel like they should have more for such a enormous...
like 25 or something.
Yeah.
And especially when you look at it on the table, when you get 2 ranks of chariots, you feel like that would have more oomph, like kick it up to crushing 3 then, if a legion option was a thing.
Yeah, it feels like this unit has been plugged into the equation of this is what a 3rd edition unit should be, this is what the points cost is for these various sizes should be, etc., etc. But it just doesn't quite fit in the army list because it feels like there's kind of, strictly speaking, better options in almost every slot. And if it was not irregular, I could see you just wanting, for the sake of variety, if nothing else, because it's not really that much worse. Instead of taking 2 regiments of knights, you take a regiment of these guys and a regiment of knights, or a horde of these guys and a regiment of knights, or whatever. I would absolutely do that if, they weren't irregular. But if I need that unlock, and I think you'll find that you really do want a lot of unlocks, even though they're relatively easy to come by in Kingdoms of Men, you want a lot of unlocks for this army, as we'll get to later on. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, the troop... The knights have got you covered there. The regiment, the mounted sergeant regiment, is cheaper and does the same thing. You miss out on the shots, but then the mounted sergeants are bloody nimble. And then the horde and legion, you just take the horde of knights instead.
Yeah, the lack of nimble, it hurts.
Yeah, regiment, yeah. It's a weird. Nah, thanks. Pass. I don't think I've ever seen chariots on the board.
No, not since 2nd edition sort of finished up and 3rd edition came in. And then I think they got a little bit of a nerf. So they used to have nimble, and they never used to have a ranged attack value. They used to mirror the attacks on the profile. And then they also got made irregular. And so I think getting 3 sort of bumps on the head just makes them almost unplayable at the moment. Like, without taking a very suboptimal list.
Yeah, they're so close to playable, though. Like, you won't lose that much by putting 1 unit in your army, but if you're basing your army around chariots, God help you. It seems like the kind of unit that might get a little bit of a spruce up in a future release. No inside goss on that. I don't actually know that.
If they have black powder weapons, just giving them that extra piercing, keeping everything else the same, that starts to make them a bit more attractive, because they're shooting while you're not having many attacks. At least they might be getting through the defense and actually doing something.
Yeah, true.
At the moment, they're just nothing. Nah, get rid of these guys. Sorry.
Yeah.
Ba-bow.
Ba-bow.
Alright, what do we got? We moving into war engines.
Ooh.
Okay, so the first one we've got here are the Siege Artillery. Speed 5, no melee, range 5, defense 4. We're not going to worry about the unit strength on these things because War Machines don't have unit strength. So you get 2 attacks with this Siege Artillery, 9-11 nerve, and that's for 90 points. The special rules are the artillery strike. So this is a 48-inch ranged blast, D3 plus 1, that ignores cover, is also indirect, so you can't shoot at things within 12. Piercing 3 and reload. So set and forget. I guess they're okay. They don't feel as good as the Abyssal Dwarf mortars.
But then
Nothing does.
I don't think we should
So-
compare we shouldn't compare every war engine to the Abyssal Dwarf cheese
No,
mortar.
I suppose that's a bit extreme, yeah.
'Cause we all know that it's a little bit undercosted, so you should really compare it to other war engines. And in fact, I think we should just read the ballista at the same time. Like you got to compare them side by side, really. There.
I mean, you've also got the cannon, so they're all kind of the same sort of thing.
I guess you're right.
So
should
what is
should we
the
just talk
ballista?
to all of them at the same time? Like,
Yeah, we'll just do that. So I'll just quickly go through the differences. So the ballista it's got the same range. All the war engines here have the same range. The ballista is range 4 instead of range 5. It's still 48-inch length. The blast is only D3, so you don't get the +1. Piercing 2, so it's 1 less than the siege artillery, and it doesn't ignore cover, is not indirect, and is reload. So all 3 have reload as well. The stats are the same, and it's 2 attacks, 9-11 nerve, but the points, it's cheaper than a siege artillery. So we've got 15 points less for 1 less on your blast. So, but the ignore cover isn't there, but they're ranged 4. It's sort of
Yeah.
But then you go to the cannon. So you take your siege artillery, give it shattering, and the ability for a grape shot. So that's a 12-inch range, 10 attacks, piercing 1, and always hits on 6s. So if something lands within that 12-inch, you can shoot it, whereas the siege artillery can't. And that's for 100 points.
these just feel like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in a lot of ways. And I
Yeah.
feel like what they've done here, which is really cool actually, Mantic, is they've basically given these 3 different... Because, of course, Kingdoms of Men is an army line that they don't currently produce. And they've just said, well, people have catapults, people have ballistas, and people have cannons, and they want to feel a little bit different. So let's just put all 3 in the list. They could have just been like artillery piece, given it the, say, siege artillery line, and that's it. Like that could have been the only entry. But quite awesomely, I reckon, they've given you a few different options that are slightly different, but effectively it boils down to the same thing. And I think you're going to end up with a cannon most of the time. Just those few extra points are worth it. It's a cannon or the ballista for me, actually, because the siege artillery is so in-betweeny. Like, I'm going to pay 10 points for shattering every day of the week, I think. Shattering's great. I'm going to grape shot very rarely. It's a hit on 6's attack, 10 attacks at piercing 1 at a 12-inch range. You might use that every now and again, and it could be kind of hilarious when you take off a wounded chaff unit that's got around behind you. But you should.
Yeah,
you should
it's
only
usually
hit
something
1.5
smaller than that
times.
flies that is aiming to charge the next turn that you might be able to take something off with a lucky roll.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really necessarily that lucky if you just want to do 1 wound, because hitting on 6's with 10 attacks, you're pretty reliably going to hit once. But
Yeah, but then you need to have a lucky nerve.
yeah, that's it, exactly.
We're looking at a 10-12 nerve.
You should only expect to do like max 1 damage for this, really. Like if you really spike the roll and somehow do like 3 damage, then rock
That's
on.
fantastic, yeah. But,
You wouldn't
yeah.
expect to. So basically, your war engine versus your ballista gets an extra hit and an extra pierce, but then the cannon gets the extra shattering on top of that, which is almost as good as an extra damage. So every time, so the cannon's just that more reliable, while as the ballista's cheap as chips. 4+ to hit versus 5+ ignore cover is basically the same.
I don't think this ballista is great, just because usually in other armies they either have 3 attacks or some sort of bump to hit, like elite or vicious or something. So it's a bit tasteless.
This is the generic
Or bland.
ballista, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the Kingdoms of Men, right? They're like, they're your bland powder kind of bros. They're the mans in a world of
I
monsters.
think we've kind of lifted hero to legendary status by this time.
Yeah. I'm assuming the rules committee is looking at Hero to give him some extra bonuses there, probably inspiring, most likely.
Make it a unit.
An extra 7 attacks or something, I'm not sure.
Seven
But
attacks.
with the war engines, I think you're taking one cannon and something else. I mean, if you wanted a second cannon, don't worry about it. Just take siege artillery for 10 points less, or a ballista just to...
What, just because
Which
you
is,
assume
points
you'd
that
be
you're
shooting the
spending.
same unit? Is that why?
Yeah.
And you can only count
Yep.
shattering once? That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, I like the cannon ballista combo. I think it's a 2 or 0 for the war engines. Take 2 or take none.
I don't know. I have always also thought that until recently. I've been trying out just one war machine in an army every now and again. And what I find is quite interesting about just taking one is it changes your opponent's deployment a lot. Or it can do anyway. And especially the ballista at only 75 points. If you just chuck a ballista in your army, in a similar way to where you might take a 75-point troop of bowmen, for example, you can't claim an objective with that ballista, but it's got such a long range and threat range, it can really muck with your opponent's deployment. And when you think about it that way and just don't really expect it to do anything in the game, like expect it to punch out a wound every now and again, which it will do, by the way, with a fair bit extra reliability over the bowman troop.
Because of the range 4.
It's
yeah.
really not that bad.
It's not bad. It's just it just feels like a nothing sort of choice.
The difference is if you take 1, it becomes plink damage, doesn't it? It's doing 1, 2 wounds a turn, where if you take 2, all of a sudden it has the possibility to take off a unit.
That's right. If you're putting 190 points into it and you're going a cannon and a siege artillery, your opponent kind of either has to deal with it or has to accept the fact that they're going to lose a unit at some point, maybe even 2 with some good rolling, which is pretty scary. So they almost need to commit some sort of countermeasure to it, or just be in combat the whole game and give it no targets, which is sometimes an option depending on the board you're on and all that kind of thing. Well, as if you get a cheap ballista, I actually think if you never take artillery, don't really like them that much, just chuck a random ballista or a random cannon in your army every now and again and just put it at the back of the board. Expect it to do nothing. And just look how much it makes your opponent sweat and think throughout the game. It can be worth it.
Just don't put it behind a hill.
Yeah, probably don't put it behind a hill.
And also keep in mind, if you start taking more than 2, you start to become that guy. And you don't want to be that guy.
Nobody wants to be that
That's
guy.
right, exactly. It's like how none of us have suggested, just take 4 cannons, done. Like, no, don't do that.
Yeah, you can take 2, and if you've got the unlocks, sure, why not?
I actually don't think it's that effective anyway, but yeah.
No. But no one likes being able to do nothing about it and just watching their units get taken off. Because often I find, like, people are not putting in the war engine hunter anymore.
Yeah, it depends, right? Like, it depends on your meta. If you're seeing a lot of war machines, you're going to get so much mileage out of that war machine hunter style unit.
Yeah.
It's good if you
But
can
even then,
take
like, even if they have one war machine hunter, they take 2 turns to get there. And if you've got 6, then they're not getting through all of them. It takes 1 or 2 rounds to get through it.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. But just take 2, please. Yeah.
So, Hugh, we're on to the monsters, I think.
The monsters. You got a mammoth and a giant. Well, the giant's a titan, but the mammoth is your monster unit.
Also, interesting, just grammatically
Yes.
here, they say monsters. There's
Monsters.
only
Only
one
one.
option, so there shouldn't be plural. Same with titans. It should just be titan or monster.
It should,
Anyway, continue.
Well, out of the category of monsters, you have only one option, which is the mammoth. It is a monster chariot, interestingly. Does that matter for anything?
Just base size.
Yeah, so it's it was on on the back end of the chariot being pulled by horses, but then I think they nerfed that, so now it's just by itself.
Cool. So has it got a larger base than the regular monster in the monster
Yes,
chariot?
That's
it,
right.
yeah.
It's 50 by 100 now instead of 50 by 50.
Yeah. So it's a longer base. Speed 7, melee 4+, defense 5+, unit strength 1, 12 attacks, 18 nerve, fearless of course, at 220 points. So they are brutal, crushing 2, strider, and thunderous charge 2. Very, very reliable monster here, because 12 attacks is a lot for a monster. It's only forced to hit, but
Go through the giant as well, because these guys are very comparable.
yeah, you're right. They really are. So your giant titan is speed 7, melee 4+, defense 5+, so exactly the same there as the mammoth. They have unit strength 1 as well, of course. D6 plus 8 attacks. So spikes somewhere between 9 and 14 attacks. 18-20 nerve, so they can be wavered, but they've got 2 extra nerve there over the Mammoth, and they're 225 points. They're only 5 points more. Brutal, crushing strength 4, fury, and strider. So even the 18 nerve, the 18-20 rather, the
Is
18 waver doesn't matter that much on the giant because he does have fury. So it's only he can only realistically only wavers on shooting.
Yep.
They both have brutal. They both have strider. They have a similar number of attacks. They have
Do
the
you want
exact
to
same stat
maybe
line.
get more attacks or less attacks?
Yeah. It's so similar.
5 points less.
Crush 4 is the slight difference between the two really is the giant's slightly better in a grind because he's got slightly higher nerve and he's got Crush 4 rather than the Crush 2 Thunderous 2 that the Mammoth has, so he loses a little bit of steam, depending on what you're fighting, of course. If it's defense 4 or less, it doesn't make a difference. But and he's dash 18 nerves. He's got that slightly lower nerve. So just the giant's slightly better in the grind, and the Mammoth is slightly better as an offensive threat purely because his base size is a little bit skinnier. So he can fit in between the units a little bit better. But
the height's marginal as well. So if we're having a look at the Mammoth, he will get cover from
people,
anything like that. But the giant won't. So not that
I
that's
guess
going to
from
come out
horses, because
often.
that's 3 difference.
Yeah, 3 difference. The base size is actually pretty huge in this. So having 100 mils, that's probably only going to be like 25 mil difference. But it does open your flank up a lot more with the Mammoth.
And you have to give it more room, because if you want it to pivot, you have to factor in, like, if you've got a couple of units flanking it, they have to leave a bit of a gap, because otherwise you can't turn.
yeah, theoretically,
The giant is square.
the monster base size versus the Titan base size should be an advantage. And sometimes it will be because it can obviously multi-charge a little bit more easily because it's a bit skinnier and things like that. But you're right, like especially if it gets wedged between 2 infantry units or something like that, or cavalry, whatever, because it's got longer than it is wide, it will have difficulty rotating out and it can get in its own way a little bit.
Yep.
So the Titan size base can actually be an advantage in some cases, especially if you want to do that cheeky charge that Sellick's been talking about recently on YouTube, whereby you go 1 inch back and then you can sort of rotate and charge something else. It can be significantly harder to do that with the Mammoth in some situations.
So what do we think about, like, obviously the giant's probably the go-to here?
The giant just seems slightly better.
I think it looks better on the board as well, like all your little small men's and 1 giant men's, maybe 2 giant men's.
It depends how cool your Mammoth looks, I guess. Mammoths can be pretty
I
cool.
suppose.
I think they're
If you can
comparable
put a Mammoth
enough.
on a chariot, even better. Take that.
Yeah, I think they're comparable enough that I'd rather have 1 of each if I had 2 than have 2, just because I think it's kind of boring to have 2 giant or 2 mammoth when you could have 1 of each. It's just going to be more aesthetically pleasing on the table and a bit more variation, give your opponent more to think about, even though it doesn't actually, like that. You might as well treat them as an identical unit. It's a bit disappointing that they're so similar. They could have had a few more points of difference, but it is what it is. It's literally 5 points difference. Probably, if you're just strictly competitive speaking, two giants is that little bit better because, just that nerve's a little bit higher. Really, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I like about the Mammoth over the giant, and it's probably the only thing, is just that its attack profile is static and it's high.
Yeah, it's slightly more reliable on the
Yeah.
offense, as I said.
It's a bit more back of the box. You know what you're getting. That's it.
Yeah.
The issue I have was I've made a lot of lists, and the issue I have, and I keep getting to the last thing, and I look at the giant and the mammoth, and then I look at the points, and then I look what I can get for the rest of the list for those exact same points.
They're not cheap.
They're not cheap, but there's so many other options that are cheap. So even if you have a look at like a regiment of knights is going to probably put out more wounds than it. Or you can start to go into some of the hordes are roughly the same price. Like you can get a horde of foot guard there as well. So that's where they always struggle to come into my list. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
I think they're pretty awesome. I think you're right when you said that you struggle. The list struggles a little bit with high defense. If you do have your cannon and artillery combo happening, and you got a bit of range against high defense things, then maybe you don't need it as much. But especially if you're not very
Otherwise, they're
shooty.
pretty good can openers.
Crush 4, man, like it's legit. It's better. It's
Yeah.
so much better than Thunderous too. Like when you can, especially since you've got Strider inbuilt. Once you pay your 10 points for Indomitable Will and your 20 points for your Potion of the Caterpillar, it's exactly the same points cost for a regiment of knights versus a giant. And I think they have, they actually do have a, even though they're such different units, they actually do have a fairly similar role. They, the knights, you're right, they do hit a little harder because they've got more attacks and obviously they're a little faster. But the giant is a lot tougher, tough as nails with 18, 20
and
nerve.
the nerve, for sure. And the height definitely comes in handy as well
so
with the square base.
They end up being a different role. The giant's more of a anchor piece. He'll hold down the center line with your infantry and give your infantry line a significantly longer threat range with charge 7 and Strider, while as the knights are more like your flanking unit and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Just make sure never to get either the giant or the mammoth into a unit that has ensnare, because that's your points are wasted. They're not hitting anything on 5s.
Very true.
With so few attacks.
Yeah, that Strider is actually so important. Monsters that hit on 4s and don't have Strider are really noticeably weaker this edition, I reckon, than those ones that do have that Strider. It makes them much more reliable.
All right, we'll leave that there. What we'll do is go for another break. We can have some listen to more Kingdoms of Men lore, and when we come back, we'll discuss our favourite heroes.
Demands.
Whereas once Primovantor was a mountain kingdom looking over fertile plains, it is now a peninsula of landmass containing the vast Bay of Geniza. Most of Primovantor that was not ruined in the war was drowned under the infant sea. The holy city of Primovantor itself survived, although it is greatly shrunk in size. The city is now mostly ruinous. Trees fill its wide boulevards, and the inhabited parts are little more than villages, divided by wilderness and crumbling masonry.
Okay, and we are here to continue on with the review. Next up, we're delving into the hero section. There seems to be quite a few heroes, so we'll see how long this takes. So first up is the General. So this is your big boy hero. Speed 5, melee 3, no ranged attack with defense 5. He is 5 attacks, or has 5 attacks, 12-14 nerve, and 85 points. Crushing 1, individual, mighty, and very, very inspiring built in. And you can give him a horse, which takes him to speed 8. And that also increases his height to 3. And that's 35 points for that horse. It's a very lush horse. Bring him to 120 points mounted.
A noble steed, I imagine.
Quite the noble steed. It probably has flowing mane of golden locks.
So the important bit, of course, very inspiring, is a 9-inch Inspire aura, which is pretty right on.
Which is like really, really good. So you don't need as many inspiring sources when you're very inspiring.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think this guy is very good. He's not bad either. It's just that when you compare him to some of the other heroes there, he doesn't necessarily have that much of a role, as is so often the case with these kinds of on-foot, in general kind of characters. They compete with like your army standard bearer for your super cheap inspiring source, but then they obviously have a few attacks and can put out reliably 1 or 2 damage. But how much is that 1 or 2 damage really worth it to you versus just taking the cheap old army standard bearer? Or if you do want the attacks to actually do damage and stuff, then upgrading it to something that flies or whatever is often the call.
It's worth note to keep in mind that he's mighty. He's the only mighty individual in this list.
Yeah, I don't think that matters that much, but it's a thing. It matters more if he's on a horse, because then you can charge out. Pardon me.
Because otherwise, he's not getting in front of things on foot.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he could.
You've sort of nailed it on the head there, Bensome, as well. So I think he's one of 2. I think the Fanatic Instigator is also mighty, but if you put him on a horse, he goes up to 115 points or something?
Plus 35, so it's 120.
120. So he goes up to 120. So he's an expensive chaff piece at that point that gives you that 9-inch bubble. I don't think he's terrible on a horse. As long as you're using him for that purpose, he's going to keep everyone inspired, and then he's going to be killed.
Yeah,
effectively.
yeah, and
he's going to be sacrificed to the blood gods.
He's perfectly reasonable supporting, especially if you've got that kind of army, a bit like Bensome was describing, where you've got a couple of regiments of knights and a couple of regiments of those. Especially if you're spending big points, on the mounted scouts with heaps of guns and stuff like that. Having him ride around with those blokes and give them inspiring, but also being a guy that can charge into something and make sure you chaff it up in a pinch, or charge in with the knights.
As a last resort,
add an extra damage or two to the knights on the charge as well. He's quite reasonable. Nothing wrong with him.
Yeah, the only sort of drawbacks that we get from him is that pretty low nerve for a general, 12, 14. But it is only 85 points, so he's quite cost effective at that point.
Yeah, he's just that in-betweeny kind of guy. So he'll fit into your list if you're a bit points tight and you need to downgrade a general on Pegasus or Winged Beast to a general on a horseback or something like that. But outside of that, probably leave him on the shelf.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bensome, I can hear your brain thinking.
Yeah, I mean, 120 points to sit behind your mounted contingent is okay, and acting as a last resort chaff piece, which he can just run through his own units, and then, because you don't have to charge, you just got to sit in front because he's mighty, they can't get around him.
True.
And then they can't overrun because he's mighty as well.
The fact that you don't have to charge, that is a good point, actually, that you can move through a unit and chaff it up, which is quite handy when you're an individual.
Yeah, and then you don't have to worry about trying to maneuver right with, like, as you would with mounted sergeants.
But there's another mini that does that better, which we'll get to in a second. So general on a Pegasus we also have, he's a hero large cav, speed 10, melee 3+, defense 5+, 4 attacks on that guy. So he actually loses attack when he gets on a Pegasus for some reason. You'd think that Pegasus is mighty hooves.
One hand on the reins.
Yeah, well, maybe so, but you'd think his, noble steed's hooves would add a little bit of punch, but it does the opposite. 12 and 14 nerve, so same nerve, gains no nerve for it, and 135 points. So really comparing him to the general on steed makes more sense, because he's 15 points more, and for that you get fly and speed 10, and you actually lose an attack, which is quite weird. He's still nimble and very inspiring, so he loses individual as well, of course, but he makes up for that by being nimble, which means that he's slightly more of a flank threat and that kind of stuff. But I think overall, on balance, being a flyer with nimble and losing individual is actually a good thing, because you can, of course, claim objectives late game and stuff, and that is a very useful thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and impacts to war machines and disordering things as well. So, no, it's very good. And the height 4 is also pretty critical, so you can see over the top of your cav and charge over the top. Pretty handy. And doesn't need mighty because he's a hero large cav, so he's sort of doing it for himself anyway there. I love this unit. 135 points. It's really, really handy, particularly if you've got a lot of flyers to come in, claim objectives, shut down war machines, shut down like late game. You can throw him away as well just to protect a unit. For 135 points, does it. You do have to play a little bit conservatively with him because of that nerve, the 12-14 nerve, but still a great unit for me.
Yeah.
If you're taking lots of flyers, would you not just take like a standard bearer on a horse for like 60 whatever points less?
75 points he is, so yeah, he's 60 points less. Maybe.
If you what do you mean? For what purpose?
I mean, what is he doing there with the rest of the flyers? Because it's only 4 extra attacks. I mean, I would think a mounted generals who's cheaper and has more attacks would be better in that regard.
It's the unit strength. So if you're taking a lot of flyers on Pegasus or the Winged Beast that we'll discuss in a second, it's all about the unit strength. So being able to have a lot of flyers that they just can't shoot because they're dealing with all of your other massive units that are real threats. And this guy isn't a real threat, to be honest, because he's only got 4 attacks because he's holding the reins. So turn 5, turn 6, that's when they start to look at these guys, and they're so hard to catch in 2 turns.
There's another Pegasus option that's also 45 points less
Yeah.
with 1 less attack and lower.
It's
nerve.
so hard to talk about these units
Yeah.
independently without talking about them in conjunction with.
I guess we'll
their
just be
homies.
jumping backwards and forwards.
That's right.
Keep
Yeah,
it in mind.
let's just keep jumping around.
Are you putting any items on this guy?
Maybe just re-rolls ones to hit.
Just the
Like,
5-pointers.
yeah.
Yeah, I think if you want a mobile, inspiring source, you're really choosing here between your mounted general, your general on Pegasus, and your army standard bearer who is mounted.
Yeah.
So those are sort of your like cheaper versions of inspiring mobility. But I agree with Sellick. If you're gonna go for a mounted general, 15 extra points, you'd have to be super tight on points. I could see myself downgrading to the general on horse and not being too upset if I was really, really tight for points in my list. But that 15 points for mainly the unit strength is well worth it. Losing 1 attack just doesn't matter that much.
Yeah, I think the only thing that the general on a horsey has over the Pegasusy is that individual. So he turns out to be a really good blocker. So after, try and rephrase this a little bit. So after a flyer flies over the top of your lines, he can pivot on the spot and still get that charge off. Where the general on a Pegasus is limited by his line of sight.
That's true. Yeah, he's better charge, better flyer defense, and that does matter for Kingdoms of Men. So that's probably very much worth keeping in mind.
For sure.
That's a good point.
Yeah, particularly I would be preferring the horse general over the Pegasus general if you're taking war machines, because things will fly over to try and shut them down.
Interesting point. Even just the on foot general, like he's only got speed 5, but he does limit where they can land at least if he's hovering around the back of your infantry blocks and stuff.
Lurking, yeah. Yeah, but there's actually a better option than that.
Who's that? The general on Winged Beast?
Yep.
No, well, we can cover the general on a winged beast now, but I was actually talking about the fanatic instigator. But we'll jump into the general on a winged beast to round off the generals. He is a hero on a monster, so a 50 mil base, speed 10, melee 3, no range, defense 5. He is also unit strength 1 with 7 attacks because the winged beast that will remain nameless is very chompy. He goes up in nerve, so he's 14, 16, but also goes significantly up in points to 190.
Yeah.
Special rules, crushing strength 2 this time. He's got fly, he's also got nimble and thunderous charge, and still maintains that very inspiring.
Yeah.
Tasty
I love
choice.
Yeah, it's a decent flying unit. 190's it's not that much.
I think it's a
considering
fantastic unit. And I
for
think
a flying threat range.
I think this is one of the larger reasons to go for Kingdoms of Men over other armies. If you're just notwithstanding all the other reasons you choose to play your army because you like the aesthetics of them or whatever else. But the general on Winged Beast, it gives you that reach out and touch threat range. It gives you a really large inspiring range, and it's just cheap as chips for that kind of a unit. Like having a unit that can hang out on flanks and threaten ranged units or threaten flanking other units, because obviously when he does flank, even with 7 attacks, he's very impactful. Thunderous 1 and Crush 2 is just going to wound everything on 2s, really. And these 3s to hit as well, so you really just can't afford to be flanked or reared by him. Even though he's not like as good as a dragon charging something in the front, just the fact that if you take 2 of these dudes and you use them to inspire your flanks instead of those generals on Pegasus or whatever, then your opponent's just in such a difficult spot. Like if you've got one of those on each flank, and they just move 20 and pivot, that's such a difficult thing to have to try to maneuver around. And for only 190 points each, it's really not that bad. Because the other thing you can do with them is have 2 together, and then combined they can go through nearly everything and they become a really big threat as well. So I think both of those options can be really nice. I really like taking 2 of these guys in your Kingdoms of Men list.
Yep.
Because they're just so threatening.
Yeah, there's a few lists flying around with 3 winged beast generals.
Ooh, yeah.
And doing a very similar thing, just triple charging things and taking it off. And then using your knights as that sort of backup.
Yeah, or if you've got
list.
3, I suppose you can have 1 in the middle holding your line down and just sort of advancing behind everything, being able to charge over it. The other 2 on the flanks. And that way, the one in the middle and either flank could double charge something and threaten that way. Plus, you're also dealing with these, just it's such a nightmare trying to maneuver your infantry units and trying to get them to pivot in such a way that they haven't got an exposed flank to one of these flyers when they're flapping around the board and have such a long range like that.
Yep, and the increase in nerve up to 14, 16 is huge for the winged beast.
Yeah, they can be quite hard to shoot off. I think people see them and think that they're going to go down fairly easily because they see them as a bit of a budget flyer, but then they don't go down that easily, or they see them as more like a dragon kind of piece, and then you're winning even more because you're getting a dragon for like 2/3 the cost of a dragon.
That's
and
right.
yeah, it's can be just as impactful when it's not charging. When it's just threatening on the board, it's just as good as a dragon. When it's actually fighting in combat, obviously, it's a little weaker. But when it's just flapping about, inspiring your bros, at 9 inches, by the way, and with extra height, and just threatening people's flanks, it's just as good as a dragon, and it's only 190 points. So can't speak highly enough of that unit.
All right. Items.
Once again, I think just the rerolls to hit or wound.
Yeah, your 5-point items, nothing wrong with that. You want to sort of keep him cheap
Yeah.
and cheerful because that's why he's so good, is that he's such a big threat for not very many points. But those 5-point items are very good on him because, you know, he's 3s to hit and usually 2s to wound on the charge. So he'll most likely get a good use out of that one reroll. But, like, you should...
Yeah, it's a high percentage of his misses.
Yeah, you should think about, when you're thinking about whether it's worth giving a unit rerolls or not, obviously the number of attacks is a big part of it, but also the likelihood that reroll will result in a success. If you're hitting on 4s or 5s and you reroll 1 die, it's almost meaningless, which is why, like, elite on Elf Bowman is not much to write home about. But when you're rerolling a die and you're doing 2+, it's going to result in an additional wound almost every time, which is a significant spike in reliability. So that 5 points, if you can sneak it on him, it's well worth it on either the mace or the blade.
I think Meat of Madness is also something to consider. It's cheap enough and it allows you to charge other flyers without being charged back.
So that gives you wild charge 1, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Meat of Madness is a cheeky one. Or the even the extra speed. A few extra points, but yeah, 22 inches is bloody far. Yeah, keep them reasonably cheap and cheerful. Certainly don't spend big points on a major magic item for them. But they're just, they're so good. They're kind of the whole package, just straight out of the box.
Yeah, because of the extra height, they can become war machine targets.
Indeed.
And they're not individuals, so it's just... And they won't, like, even the 14, 16 will still get knocked out of the sky pretty quick from war machines.
Yeah.
This is true. But then, on the other hand, they can threaten war machines and you don't mind as much as you would with a dragon or something, charging a backline war machine with them and then having them all sort of flap about and turn around on turn 5 to threaten the rear of the army. You're actually quite happy with that points investment at 190 if that's the way it's going to go. While as other units in Kingdoms of Men, there's not a lot of things that you can get that you're actually wanting to threaten war machines with. Because if you're using knights or something for that, that's a significant points investment.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's move on to the Army Standard Bearer. So this is your flag waver, the cheap and cheerful fella, speed 5, melee 5, no ranged, defense 4. 1 attack, 9/11 nerve for 50 points. Individual very inspiring are his special rules, and you can give him a horse, which is not as noble as the general, because it's only 25 points. The usual Loot of Darkness on this guy.
Yeah, he's a good musician like most standard bearers for some reason.
Yep.
Yeah, the loot on this guy, particularly in this army, Banechant is huge. So many different attacks coming in, particularly if you're running the foot guard. Hitting on 3s with an extra crushing strength is great, and having this guy just chilling behind him, that's his whole job.
Yeah.
Just don't get him charged, keep him alive, and he'll keep most things alive.
Army standards are like big, heavy things, right? Big old poles. It's almost like the mast of a ship, obviously skinnier than a mast, but like it's a big old flag that you're holding up, very heavy and unwieldy. I assume that's why they've 1 attack at melee 5 most of the time. You know, so how does one play a loot whilst holding that bastard in the air at the same time?
It's built into the pole.
Oh, I see.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So when he's holding the flag up, that's his fret hand. So all he has to do is strum with the other one.
I see.
I know. I thought it was pretty simple. I don't know what you're talking about.
But and obviously they'd be hard to see. Why don't they get stealthy or something? Since it's so insatiably dark around all these standard bearers. How do you even see the standard?
No, it's just like metal music. Like they title their albums of death and violence and whatnot, but it's not really. It's just ballads and shit.
Yeah, right on. It's just...
I mean, ballads and stuff.
You should always model your army standard bearer, if possible, in like a with long metal hairdo, and maybe he doesn't even have a standard. Like maybe that's just a misnomer of a name. He's actually just holding his He's holding his metal horns in the air while he like just strums away at his guitar. And
his arms
what's
are
inspiring
standard.
about him, Just gets everyone frothing.
But other than that, I'm not giving him anything else. And to the point.
Yeah, like, I mean, in the second edition, you might have given him the breath attack, the dragon breath attack, but now that that's been nerfed down to 8 for 30 points, I think, off the top of my head, doesn't have the same value, I don't think.
The shooting, the various shooting magic items, like the grenades and stuff as well, would have a bit more of a appeal if it wasn't for the fact that the loot exists, just because having a Bane chant on a character is just a really useful thing. And you're almost certainly going to have a whole bunch of mans standing around nearby him that could really use a boost to their crushing strength to make them more effective. Like, that's just going to happen.
Yep. His whole job is to inspire 9-inch bubbles and to stay alive and to give things Bane chant. That is his job.
Exactly.
Yep.
And ultimately, for 75 points, 10 points less than your general on foot, yes, he can't fight, but having that Bane chant is often worth more wounds in a combat, especially since you're probably Bane chanting a horde. It's likely to be worth more damage than the general's attacks would be. So you can't chaff something up like a general can, but for generally, for 10 points less, I'd rather the standard bearer.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, easy done. Let's move on.
All right, Hugh, you've got the most epic
aptly named
character.
The most well-known of units.
Do you remember when we had
in
Kyle on the show
yeah.
and he was telling us about how in 3rd edition they've actually changed a lot of those more generic names and given things like more interesting names and stuff?
Why did he lie to us?
Just straight up lied. We were asking him about like Ratkin units and things, and that like threw him for a loop a little bit. It's hilarious. He was just trying to do the right thing and sell the units.
Do right by
because
Mantic.
I'm sure a lot of the Mantic units have cooler names. I don't really know how many of them do, but certainly not in the old armies of Panathor here, because we have Hero. So Hero, you'd think which do you think's more? What's more inspiring to you, Bensome? A general or a hero?
Specifically speaking, the general is less inspiring than a hero.
You would have thought
A hero is like the epitome of inspiration.
exactly. Like that's literally like it's built into the name of hero, right? That you're an inspiring kind of character.
Anyone can be a general if they're promoted.
Yeah,
You can't just be promoted to a hero.
yeah. It's
This is ridiculous.
really like, I suppose it's the misnaming of the power inspiring, really, isn't it? Because it's more like inspiring is more like you can imagine your general giving out orders and being like hold the line or whatever else, while as the hero just
Not even that. These generals are very inspiring, and this one is not even normal inspiring.
I know.
It's a
So
disgrace.
he's crushing one as an individual. He is
Not even self-inspiring.
completely
Come
uninspiring. He
on.
doesn't even inspire himself. I know, to fight the evil baddies and be heroic.
He's been in the army too long. He doesn't give it. He doesn't care anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the caveat, guys. That's what we're totally missing here. He's a hero, and he wasn't a great fighter 25 years ago, but now he's 65. He's only got 3 attacks. His back's starting to
He's
go.
a retired hero.
That's why his nerves
That's
only
why we're
10,
maxing
15.
out on heroes and heroes on Pegasi, because we want
That's it.
an army of grumbling old veterans.
Because he is melee 3, so he still knows what he's doing.
He's got
He
experience.
still knows what he's doing.
Yep.
But yeah, he's getting a bit feeble. He's only 3 attacks. He's still got crushing 1. He's got like a bit of strength in his wiry old bones. But nerve 10-12, yeah, he's a bit shell-shocked. Bit scared from all the...
PSG.
You know, he's seen some shit, man. Like this hero, he's been through a lot. And obviously he rolled better in his youth, I presume, to actually
PTS,
kill something, which he would presumably have to have done to become a hero. But in any case, you can give him Indomitable Will for 5 points if you really feel like it.
Cheap one. Yep.
It's I mean, he's 40-point character. If we didn't cover that,
He's at least less than the army bearer. He's the cheapest.
he's such a potato.
Oh, maybe this guy doesn't wear very good clothes
he's
either.
not mighty.
Yeah, he's been drinking for years.
He's not even a mighty
Yeah,
hero.
needs a shave.
He really is a feeble old man. And you've got to compare him to the hero on Pegasus, which is slightly more heroic
It's an
place to
upgrade.
be. Gives him fly and nimble, of course, speed 10. Same number of attacks. So he doesn't lose an attack. He can ride a Pegasus without holding the reins, unlike this young whippersnapper in the general. That's right. He knows how to, hold it astride with his thighs, his mighty heroic thighs. And he can ride around for 90 points, so more than double the cost of himself on foot, but that's because the Pegasus is better than he is, let's be honest.
That's it. Yep, 50 points for the Pegasus.
5 points if you really want to give him Indomitable Will, which actually is not...
His Pegasus costs more than he does.
It's actually
valuable. Yeah, because you don't want him to waver at just the wrong moment when you really need him to be able to chaff something up. And so, funnily, we've been talking quite a bit about what the good chaff units are in this army. For some reason, it's come up again and again. I guess because there's so many cool options in Kingdoms of Men for it, and they don't have gargoyles, so they don't have anything that just makes them all redundant. But this guy is actually the best chaff unit in the army.
Correct.
The heroic guy on a Pegasus. He can do what Sellick was talking about doing with the general before by hiding behind your dudes, flying straight over them with his helpful height 3. Even, his height 4, sorry. So he can see over cavalry, which I always thought was a little bit weird because I thought Pegasus would be about the same height as a cavalry. I don't know.
I think they kind of
like
hovering.
a hover.
Yeah. Well, not hovering. They're just flapping in place.
That makes more sense. Because they can also charge over hills. I've been caught by this, actually, and it did significant damage to my prospects in that particular game when I was charged by a... Oh, no, this was particularly bollocks, actually, because it was a nature Pegasus, which is height 4, even though it's got no one riding it, which annoys me. Because it's literally the height of a horse. It should be shorter than a knight, but I guess you're right, maybe it was hovering. Anyway, they can charge over hills, so keep that in mind when you're trying to approach with your big, nasty unit. And then they just charge straight over a hill at you with his feeble 3 attacks and sort of give someone a bonk on the noggin. And then, they can't go through him. Or they can go through him, but that would take a little time to mop up the old boy.
I'm surprised they didn't give Hero like a lame Pegasus, which was like speed 8.
Just, the old donkey or something.
But no, they give him a magnificent steed fitting for a general.
So what's the...
But then they expect him to sacrifice himself by throwing himself in the way of oncoming knights and whatnot.
Indeed. The hero on foot, what's the use of him? 40 points, no inspiration. You could give him the inspiring talisman, in which case he costs, 15 points more than the army standard bearer.
Or 20,
For 2 extra
attacks. A nerve, 3s to hit instead of 5, a defense, a crushing.
But it's only normal inspiring, not very.
Yeah, which is the same as the... Oh no, the Army Standard Bearer is very inspiring as well. Because he's such a metal lead singer. You do actually get quite a bit for that 15 points when you talk it out. Your defense, your melee, etc. But that doesn't actually really mean anything, does it? Because he's not mighty. If he charges something with his feeble old bones, you're guaranteed to miss all 3 attacks or whatever. Yes, his 3s to hit with crushing 1. It's reasonable for him to do 1 wound and therefore disorder the unit and prevent it from charging through him. But what will always happen, believe me, I've done this with White Kings many times.
Only if it's super important.
When you really need him to block that charge, you're going to be greatly regretting having spent 40 points on your hero instead of 90 points on a legit chaff unit when he fluffs his attacks and then they just steamroll right over him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just left behind the unit going, oh, what the hell? How did I survive this again?
Yeah. Goes back to drinking.
Yep, he's a pelican, but funnily enough, that hero on Pegasus is one of the better units in this game. He really is.
He isn't. The Pegasus is.
The Pegasus is. That's true, I suppose. The Pegasus should be inspiring. He should have inspiring horses. Horses only.
That's it. Yeah.
All right, that's enough on the hero, is it?
It feels like we should talk more about it, but it's depressing, so let's move on.
All right, so the next up we've got the assassin, the human assassin, who is speed 6, so faster than a normal human.
He's quick on his feet.
He is quick on his feet. Melee 3+, range 4+, defense 4+, no unit strength naturally, because he's an individual. Attacks 5 up. The nerve is 10-12 with 80 points as his cost. Lots and lots of special rules, which makes him up to that 80 points. So crushing strength 1, he's got duelist, he's individual, he's stealthy, he's vicious. He's got throwing daggers that are 12-inch piercing ones. And he, too, like Hero the hero, has Indomitable Will for 5 points.
I mean, I guess that's where the inspiring comes in. He inspires himself if you pay for it.
Yeah, I suppose so, which is okay. It's actually I'd pay for it. It's 5 points. But he does. What's interesting about this guy is he's a very easy comparison to the Ratkin assassin and the Twilightkin assassin, who both are. Interestingly, he has an extra attack, the human, compared with the super elf or whatever, which is a bit weird. So he's got 5 attacks instead of 4, which they generally have. All of those units have duelist, individual, stealthy, crushing 1. And they all have vicious, in fact, believe it or not. So they all have like identical rules there, and they all have 12-inch range, piercing 1 shots. The main difference here is, unlike the Twilightkin and Ratkin equivalent, he does not have scout, so he can't move up at the start of the game, and then potentially get those turn 1 charges.
Are the speed the same?
No, the other 2 are 7, so he goes down 1 speed as well. Yeah. And of course there's a few other differences, like the Twilightkin guy has a elite as well, and blah blah blah. But basically, they fulfill that similar role of like hovering around, chucking sharp stuff at things, and then hoping to get the opportunity to charge a individual that isn't particularly powerful.
Yeah.
Because of that duelist. Because they have so few attacks, they've deliberately kept these assassins' attacks down to 4, and in this guy's case 5. He's actually noticeably better at killing wizards and things like that than the other assassins are because of that extra attack. Because he goes up to 10 attacks against a wizard or something on 3s to hit, piercing, crushing strength 1. He's got a very good chance of going through an unhurt individual, while as the other assassins, let me tell you from significant experience of charging assassins into individuals, doing exactly what assassins, like literally doing what it says on the tin, how frequently they fluff their rolls because they just don't have that many attacks, or they do 5 damage or something, but then just roll a bad nerve roll and you don't get them, and you're like, damn, come on, man, you had one job. Yeah. Wings of the Honey Maze, awesome.
Yep. Makes them a bit more expensive, but then it makes them much more useful.
Absolutely. Going down to defense 3 is a bit of a bummer, but it does make him more vulnerable to mainly shooting, because if he gets charged, he's in trouble anyway.
But he's stealthy.
But yeah, he's stealthy and he's individual, and if he's hiding around in forests and stuff, they've got an awful lot of negatives to hit him.
You're giving him the Indomitable Will?
Yeah, I think so.
5 points?
Yeah.
If he's
Why
out,
not
he's
for 5
probably going to
points?
be out by themselves, so probably a good idea.
If you need to shave 5 points at the end, I'd take it off him. I don't think it's really a deal breaker, but might as well.
And how many assassins are we taking?
1. Precisely 1 is the correct number. With the Wings of the Honey Maze, what he can do is threaten war machines, which he realistically can't with just speed 6 on foot. Without the scout is a downer for him versus the other assassins. But what I haven't mentioned is that he's like 20 points plus cheaper than the other ones, which is pretty nice. So for only 120 points, is it 40 for the wings? Or 45?
Yep.
40, yeah. So 120
40.
or 125 with Indomitable Will. I think that's the way to take him for me, because he just becomes such a more interesting threat that your opponent has to think about, especially if you've got a few other flies flapping about, bothering people. Because in a pinch, you can even go in with a unit of knights or go in with a general on wing beast or something and just add a few extra attacks to a combat. He can also easily fly behind a unit and start flinging throwing daggers at them and just make your opponent have to think about it. He's good against sort of almost any army without just like mass defense 5. If they've got some little cheap supporting units that he can threaten, or war machines or whatever, really tasty little unit for his price point.
Just make sure if you're going to combo charge with something else to try and take it out, make sure it's going to be taken out, because otherwise the counter charge, they'll be charging the assassin and overrunning into the other unit that's helping.
Indeed, that has happened to me quite a few times with these kinds of units. Is I'll fluff the charge and then they basically get him for free. Although with 10-12 nerve, especially if you've popped your Indomitable Will, which you possibly haven't done because you need to have the foresight to do it. You can do it. You can do it at any time in your turn, can't you? So you can do it at the end of the turn. You can like find out that you've fluffed the charge and then do it. In which case that could be a smart move. And then your opponent's like, well, do I charge the assassin? And he is inspired. Depends on the unit, of course, but at least there's a chance that they won't go through him then. Yeah, he's a cool little unit.
Okay.
Seriously consider the wings.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Just for any assassin character, really. But anyway, let's move on to the Fanatic Instigator. This is a Speed 5 hero, melee 3, defense 4, no range attacks. 6 attacks with this fella. Fearless 14 for 85 points. And he is Crushing Strength 1, Mighty and Wild Charge D3 built in.
Yep, I love this guy with the wings. The only disappointing thing, and I was discussing it with Huw before the cast, is that he's not inspiring even.
Yeah,
to
it should be Inspiring Berserker, so
Yeah.
the Instigator sort of instigates the other fanatics.
You probably have to be a few more
Or
points.
maybe he instigates like the militia mob into becoming fanatics.
Yeah.
But what is he instigating? I guess that's what I want to know.
I don't know.
Let's Google define instigate and see.
He's instigating. Rising up against your sanity and cutting loose. Pull your shirt off.
Instigate, bring about, or initiate. Yeah, so he's making people go nuts.
Well, not really. He's not inspiring at all. But
Well, he's not
either way-
inspiring. He's instigating. He's egging them on. They don't look at him and go, "Oh yeah, let's re-roll the nerve." They go, "Ooh, let's drop our melee to 3 and get crushing 1."
Interestingly, unlike the other kind of fanatic units in the list, he's not that easy to kill because he doesn't have defense 3. He does have
Fearless
he has
14.
D4, and Fearless 14's on an 85-point hero
That's
is
pretty
actually
good.
really good.
Yep.
That's very hard to remove, especially if he's standing in a forest or something. He does have Mighty, so he can stand. I see a use for this guy.
Good chuff.
He can not only can he obviously charge and protect your backlines reasonably nicely against cheap little units of flyers and stuff like that, but he can also run into a forest. This is what I used to do with the old Plague Priest dudes before they got
Stickman.
Aubergine Stickman. As I'd chuck him in the forest. Admittedly, he had ensnare, so he did it even better. But just standing in that forest and going, yeah, come at me. You're -1 to hit. I've got a dash 14 nerve. Units that you would expect to go through him often don't, and then he holds them up for multiple turns, and then you're really laughing.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I said it right at the start. I love the Instigator with the wings.
Yep.
I think they're one of the best in this list. War
Definitely
Machine
the best
Hunters.
War Machine Hunter, definitely.
Yeah.
The Fly 20 with the Wild Charge on top of that.
Yeah, it's delicious. And late game, that Mighty really comes in, particularly if you can fly 20 inches or...
Yeah, I was going to say I much prefer the Assassin, but I'm not even sure that I do because, that...
I mean, if you're hunting characters, sure, because you get 10 attacks
Yeah.
instead of 6, but he's
The
not
Dash
mighty.
14 is underrated, I think.
I think we're rating it pretty
Yeah.
well.
I think that's the only
Fearless
reason.
14 is always
I
good.
think that's the only reason we're even considering him compared with the Assassin. That's that dash 14.
If he was
Yep.
10-12,
Yeah, or if he was even
Yeah,
dash
no.
12, I'd just never take him over the Assassin. But the dash 14 does give him that extra little bit of staying power. It's basically just the hope that when you put him in something in front of something, they don't go through him in one turn. That's really the difference, isn't it? While as the Assassin, instead of getting put in front of something, is more like he gets put behind something and then he gets to shoot it every turn. And 5 shots at piercing 1 and 3s to hit and vicious. And vicious is for both ranged and melee, by the way.
That's
He's actually
true, yep.
pretty good. He's range 4+, so you're looking at 2 to 3 hits at Pierce 1 reliably. It's not bad. It's really worth considering.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Every time the Fanatic's not charging something, the Assassin could be chucking sharp stuff.
That's very true. Yep.
yeah. But I think Sellick's right. Wings, because he's mighty, is probably the choice over any other for that particular role.
Yeah, for that role.
yeah.
I think the Assassin's probably a bit more versatile. The Fanatic has one job, pretty much. Kill some hunters and then
get in the
late
way.
game, sort of Mighty. Yeah, or add in an extra couple of wounds.
Yeah, I think I prefer the Assassin overall. The one less attack doesn't matter that much. It does matter, but it doesn't matter that much when you consider the extra threat of, like if it's a war machine or something, you'll go through it almost as easily, so it doesn't really matter. Against little light things,
And
it
he's
doesn't matter
slightly
that much.
better at grounding flyers.
Slightly better at grounding flyers. And that shooting really makes the difference. But if you've got a lot of forests on your board, the dream of getting that Instigator to survive a charge, if he does survive one charge in the game, you'd be very happy you took him over the Assassin. So just take to taste, I reckon. Whatever you prefer.
So next up, we've got the only spellcaster. So we've got the Wizard, who is an infantry model with spellcaster level 1, speed 5, melee 5, defense 4, no ranged attacks. It's only got 1 attack. Nerve is 10-12 for a measly 50 points. It's only got 1 special rule, and that is individual. It's out of the box. Spells is 5 or 6. Comes with a myriad of different options. Mounts on a horse for 25 points. Goes up to speed 8. Or you can chuck him on a Pegasus. Naturally loses the individual. gets the fly and the nimble and speed 10 for 35 points. And then the spell options are Bane Chant 2 for 20 points, Heal 3 for 20 points, Lightning Bolt 3 for 20 points, or you can replace the Fireball 6 for the Lightning Bolt 3. And finally, you can also get Wind Blast 5 for 20 points.
So is the hero getting jibbed? Is he getting charged more for the Pegasus? Because that's 50 points to put the hero on the Pegasus, but it's only 35 for the wizard to get one.
I know, mate.
Oh, mate, hero's getting shafted via all sides.
So your wizard is only 85 points on the peg, just stock standard with Fireball 6. He's kind of almost better than the hero.
He's great.
I was saying the hero's the ultimate chaff unit for your 90 points, but
5 points less, get in the way.
5 points less, he can still get in the way. He's got the same
Fireball.
nerve, and he's got a Fireball. Oh shit! Or maybe I was wrong.
He's just not doing anything in melee.
Yep, this guy is amazing. Particularly in lots of knights type armies. Chuck him with Bane Chant, so that's 100 points, and he is a Bane Chanting, Fireballing, or Lightning Bolting chaff unit. It's great.
So cheap for what he does there. Really, really solid.
So cheap.
And so versatile. Look at all those different things he can do. He can also just stand behind your troops and inspire them with the Inspiring Talisman as well, and just chuck out Bane Chants in a similar way to the Army Standard Bearer with the loot for much the same price. If you love that kind of unit so much and you've got like a really wide infantry line with lots of hordes of polearms or something like that, I could see taking both of those characters rather than sort of your alternatives of taking generals and other on-foot dudes to babysit them.
Yep. It's a great unit. I'd take 2 of these guys generally, purely because, and put them on Pegasus so that they've got unit strength in the late games, so they just buff all the different combats, and then late game they just run away and claim table quarters, claim objectives, etc.
I always want to do it, but then never actually do. But what about 2 on Pegasus with Wind Blast? That's pretty cool. You got Wind Blast 10.
I don't think it's enough Wind Blast.
Wind Blast 10 is quite a lot of Wind Blast.
Wind Blast 10, yeah.
That's 5 inches. Something.
I think we always find that it's too situational for it to be effective, because they have to be in the right position, they have to get it off, and then they have to make sure that there's room for them to be pushed as well.
Because they're so mobile, though, you can get into a flank and push them in like an awkward direction or whatever a little bit more easily than you can when you've just got a Wind Blast on foot kind of dude.
You've noticed that a lot of people like to line up their army, so if you're trying to push them in the flank, they're moving an inch, maybe half an inch before they hit another unit. Yeah. I mean, it makes it more awkward for them to try and pivot.
Depends on the circumstance. Like, imagine a knight unit is coming, like he's more central, your Pegasus guy, and a knight unit's coming around the side of a forest on the flank. You move them up, you move the Pegasus up at such an angle that you can Wind Blast them, and then you just Wind Blast them behind the forest, so they're just like out of the game for a turn. Like, you're pretty happy with that scenario.
Yeah, I guess Wind Blast itself loses value in armies that don't have Surge. Just a little bit. I think that the Wind Blast combo where you can move something and then Surge in the same phase increases its value. And I think that when you have a look at the Wizard itself, the rule of thumb is you don't take more than 2 spells. And I think you've got to take your Bane Chant, and I think most of the times you will be taking Lightning Bolt over the Fireball just for the extra range.
If you've got a bunch of knights, I think you've got to take the Bane Chant. If you don't have knights in your army and he's flying around doing his own thing, just occasionally fireballing stuff and getting in the way of stuff and not really having a good target to Bane Chant in the direction that he's looking, because of course he's not individual, then I could see one of the other spells instead of Bane Chant. But yeah.
Conjuring Staff as well. You've got to remember to take the Conjuring Staff to reroll one of them spell dice. Just makes Bane Chant much more likely to succeed.
Definitely helps. It's definitely at its best with Bane Chant, isn't it? But yeah, I don't know. I like that item, but still often find that I end up trimming it. It's one of those things. It's like the last few points, and you're just a little bit over or whatever, and you're like, it's a bit marginal. Chop that off.
Not much else to say about him, is there?
Last dude, the unique unit,
bloke.
the El Capitán. So he is not a captain. He's not a general. He's not a hero. He is the captain.
There may be other captains, but they're not the
That's
captain.
right. There is exactly one of him, as it says in square brackets. He is...
Everyone else is a captain.
Indeed. He's speed 5, melee 3+, defense 5+, 5 attacks. So you might find that reminiscent of the general, because it is identical to the general. He's also got 13, 15 nerves, so 1 extra pip over the general. He's just that little bit braver. despite the fact that he is in fact a captain, not a general, whatever. But sorry, he's not a captain. He's the captain.
That's the point of difference.
120 bangers for this bloke. He is on foot as well, so that is an expensive on-foot infantry fighting model for Kingdoms of Men, given how cheap all the others are. But then he's got the obligatory Crush 1 individual. He does have Mighty. So at the moment he's looking like just a very expensive general, so not loving it. But then he's got very inspiring, of course. And he has Rallying 1, which is awesome. He's also got Master Tactician. So this is sort of what you're paying, I'd say, about 25 points for roughly, maybe 20. Which is you can redeploy D3 of your own units after deployment is finished, but before scout moves are made. So that's a pretty sweet ability.
Can be handy depending on the army build-up.
Yeah, you can plan for it. So I think the way to use that ability is forget that it's D3, do a refused flank kind of maneuver with it a lot of the time, or leave a flank weak that your opponent thinks is weak or whatever, and plan to redeploy one unit, because you get to redeploy one every time. Sometimes you'll get two.
Redeploy that Night Horde.
That's it. Redeploy that Night Horde or Night Regiment, it might be, or a Giant or something. Maybe even a War Machine if you've got it. If you can put a War Machine far forward and your opponent's like, oh yeah, I can put a few units to take that out or whatever, and then you just redeploy it.
Or even if they kind of move some tasty targets out of the line of sight of a War Machine because they're afraid of it.
Just plan to do it once, and that can be a really, really valuable thing. It is significantly better than like a Scrying Gem equivalent, which costs a reasonable amount of points and makes your opponent deploy some extra units, even though that is a useful deployment advantage as well. If you plan for this and you can catch your opponent with his pants down, it's going to be well worth its points every single time that you manage to do that. If you don't, and it just has sort of no real marginal effect, or the deployment falls in such a way that you're like, oh yeah, I can just shuffle this unit over a bit and it doesn't really matter, then you've sort of wasted your points and you might as well have taken just a army standard bearer with a loot or something and saved yourself a few points.
He's quite expensive, but I find he's better in a lower point game because you have more room to move.
Oh yeah,
because your whole army would be deployed at that point.
It's not all about that redeploy as well. Like Rallying 1 is pretty damn good.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
35 points for a horse. I mean, 155, but it makes sure that you can move that rallying where you need it. But if you're just going to sit behind the line, then don't worry about the horse.
Yeah, the Rallying 1 is what you pay for, I think, with all the hordes. So they go up to like mid-20s for some of their waivers and nerves. So that's what you pay for, I think.
What we'll do is we'll have one more break, and when we come back, we'll discuss potential allies and run through some example lists.
Upon the Ardovikian plain, new nations are being born. From the Dragon's Teeth Mountains in the south to the edge of the Mammoth Steppes, hundreds of small kingdoms, independent townsteads, isolated keeps, and fortified manses have been established and lost to ruin, each one alternately warring and allying with its neighbors. The vast majority are ruled by humans, although there are realms of all kinds to be found, from small dwarf hordes to, albeit rarely, minor elf princedoms, and even, in isolated forests or bleak moorlands, the lairs of vampires. After 12 centuries, some are only now showing true promise, absorbing others through treaty or conflict and becoming players on the grander stage.
Okay, let's get this finished. Allies. Are we taking allies with the kingdoms of men?
I don't think they really need it. I think if you're going to take anything, you would be looking at butchers. Obviously, they're the flavour of the month at the moment. Just to get you that extra crushing strength. They're not dependent on leadership either, so it's a pretty good inclusion.
That's right, because I don't think we mentioned, but the kingdoms of men are neutral, so they can take anyone as allies.
Yeah, I don't know. Something really high defense or something that's really high crushing are the main things that they kind of lack in a little bit. So, yeah, could see the good old stone golems that you often recommend. They're not irregular, aren't they?
No.
Yeah, I kind of turn to thematic allies like dwarves or elves for some extra shooting or defense. A bit of crack there.
Yeah, that makes sense. But nah, just take your mans. Your mans are versatile. They're
versatile enough that you don't need it.
You got you want lots of boots on the ground. You want lots of glorious men fighting off the horrors and tribulations of the evil fantasy world. That's kind of the appeal of being, the common man. I think you don't need to ally in a bunch of fancy-pantsy nonsense. You're probably not taking Kingdoms of Men. You're probably not building a Kingdoms of Men army because you're trying to be like the most powerful army in the universe or anything. You're not trying to like cheese it up. So just forget about allies, and unless you, like you say, Bensome, you want to sort of, you've got some fluff reason or whatever. Maybe your Kingdoms of Men are nearby some dwarf holds and they're their ally friends or elves. Like take allies for more of those sort of fluffy, fun reasons rather than because you're trying to.
Or if they're jerks, take some Force of the Abyss because they can do that.
Yeah, I guess so. You could if you got an evil man's themed army, that could be cool as well.
All right then. Then how about we go through some lists?
Overall thoughts before I just talk to the list on Kingdoms of Men and the way that I sort of see them as my philosophy for playing them, I guess, which I suppose is similar to my philosophy. Maybe it's just my play style more of like a boots in the ground kind of play style. But I think like if you're taking Kingdoms of Men, you're not doing it for units like Foot Guard for me, or even necessarily Knights, even though I'm sure you guys have units of both of them in your armies. Or maybe even the Berserker guys. Like that's or other armies do those kinds of things better, in my opinion. So I feel like for Kingdoms of Men, you want boots on the ground galore. They do hordes of infantry just amassed all over the shop better than pretty much any other army. And they have a lot of like interesting, useful support units that go really well with that and making that the backbone of your army. So I feel like that's, for me, the way I envision Kingdoms of Men playing.
Well, then go through your army.
Okay.
Tell us about it.
Alrighty, I've got a bowman troop and a militia mob regiment.
What point list is this?
This is 2250, which is a bit of a weird points level, but I played this actually in a recent tabletop simulator tournament. So we wanted to try 2250 out. It's actually the first time I've ever played that particular points level. So a bit different, but whatever. I know the Americans love it. So you got a troop of bowmen, a militia mob regiment, so your 2 units to hold your backline objectives and stuff, as we spoke about. Just sort of took one of each, I guess. You got a polearms regiment, 2 polearms hordes, a spear phalanx horde. So heaps of boots on the ground.
That's a lot of boots already.
You got 1 defensive one, and the other 2 are more like able to punch back a bit with the polearms hanging out there. And I actually haven't gone for Indomitable Will on anyone, which is probably not necessarily the best choice. I wonder if it's worth taking out that polearms regiment, removing it, and then just like in hindsight looking back through this list and then putting like heaps of Indomitable Will on a bunch of different dudes. But I've sort of gone for like minimum on the magic items and on the upgrades and stuff to just get more hot, warm mans. I got a unit of knights with a potion of caterpillar, regiment of those guys. We've got a ballista, a wild ballista pick, so that could also be your unit, that or the militia mob or the bowman. Any of these sort of cheap units, you could potentially choose to remove one of them to add upgrades sort of all over the joint, because this is almost completely upgrade free, this army. I've then got a mammoth and a giant, so again one of each. I've got an assassin with the wings, a hero on Pegasus who does have a wild Indomitable Will pick, I guess. Sorry, he doesn't. I've just changed it. He doesn't have that anymore. I've also got 2 generals on winged beasts, one of which has the blade of slashing, because that seemed better as I'm reading this out than the Indomitable Will on the Pegasus. So I've got 4 flying heroes, actually. One of them's more for killing war machines and stuff in the form of the assassin or little heroes. And one of them's more chaffy in the form of the hero, which in hindsight, having been talking through the armies with you guys, I'd probably change him to a wizard, because I think that's probably a bit better. And I have got the captain. So once I took all these winged heroes that are really useful for a range of different things and threatening. And the idea is in this army, you go in, you combo charge in some way. Either use your hordes of polearms or your monsters plus a misc general, because the generals are just flapping about all over the shop, or a unit of knights. And basically you have so many threats So it's so threat dense, and it's just so many boots on the ground, but you still somehow have enough points to have like 4 big threatening monsters in the list. So yeah, it's not shooty at all. It's just it's got like a smattering of tiny bow shots, but for the most part, it's melee, get up in your face and just cause you a bunch of grief kind of human army. And just because I had to have I had a few points left over. I needed someone to hang out back with all those boots on the ground to keep them inspired when the generals flap off and do something else. I felt like the captain was a good choice for that, because the captain can rally my relatively low defense bros in the middle, either the pole arms or the spear phalanx, and then he can also get that redeploy happening, so I can sort of do. I'm thinking of that mainly for either the knights. So I can put them on one flank and then chuck them on the other or something. Or if I'm comfortable with their deployment, I can do it with the generals. So I can do generals one on each flank and then do a bit of a bait and switch and put both generals on the same flank and overload a flank. Or I can, put them both together, and then when they put a bunch of counter units out, I can flap one of the generals off someplace else. So yeah, that's the sort of thoughts behind the list.
Did you mount the captain?
I didn't mount the captain. I felt like he didn't need it in this particular list because his role was to wander behind the infantry, because I didn't have that. I wonder if I'm sort of paying a fair few gimmick points in he's probably the flexier slots. If you were trying to be really competitive, taking him out for a loot of insatiable banner bro and getting a cheeky, like almost 50 points there to spend on various upgrades across your army, like Indomitable Will and this and that, might be a better option, especially if you're playing a lot of high tier opponents and you think your redeploy really isn't going to cut the mustard. But I felt like I suppose you could argue that I basically cut Indomitable Will out of the list in exchange for having this cheeky redeploy rallying bro, which is probably not the coolest, but not the most effective. But I just like him; he's really cool.
So how many total units, and what's your unit strength?
I have a total unit strength of 26, which is not too shabby at 2250, pretty high. I have 15 drops. So I got 15 drops, 26 unit strength, and then still managed to fit in 4 Inspirers and 4 monsters. So yeah, that's why, like, you go through that list and you think, oh, why haven't you given, like, as we talk through it, why haven't you given Indomitable Will here? Why haven't you given, like, a magic item there or whatever? But when you actually, see it all together, that's just, it's sort of got a bit of everything for quite a lot of dudes.
Yeah, I don't think I've gone a bit upgrade heavy on my list.
That's good. It'd be interesting to see a different kind of list. So what does yours look like?
Yeah. Well, what I've taken is a shield wall troop with Indomitable Will, because I think that's a fantastic chaff unit, and they're sitting in front of my horde of foot guard. They have Brew of Sharpness, Indomitable Will, and exchanged their defense for crushing. So hitting on 2 is crushing 1 with 25 attacks. They're going to be flanked by a horde of fanatics and 2 troops of fanatics. So the 3 troops there should be enough to deter anything getting into the hordes that will be able to take them off in 1 hit. Cool. So it can punch back and kill them. Then I've got another section of knights. There's a horde of those guys with the caterpillar pot, Indomitable Will, a troop of mounted sergeants for their particular chaff to get in the way, 2 regiments of mounted scouts with upgraded black powder weapons. That's what I was talking about before, that little kind of blob there of the knights and the chaff and the shoot. And to help them out, I've got the general on Winged Beast. I had 15 points, so I've given them Trickster's Wand. Hex doesn't do anything, so it's probably wasted points. And then, so he'll be inspiring them and then rushing out to do whatever the flying dude does. Standard Bearer with loot, so I got my Bard there. He inspires the entirety of my foot troops there. It should be easy enough with the very inspiring, and that Bane chant to knock the crushing 1 up to crushing 2.
Nice.
So it should be good. And then I've got a Pegasus wizard. He's got Bane chant Conjurer's staff to help out in case it gets a bit nasty in that foot fight. So I've got 2 units with crushing 2. He's also got lightning bolt, not fireball, so he can also zap a couple of things from distance. and on the Pegasus for the unit strength.
Yeah, nice one.
So this is a 2,000 point list, this one. So it's a little bit lower. I've got 12 drops and 22 unit strength, but I think I've got 2 nice chunky sections of army and enough ranged support to kind of knock back anything that feels like it's going to have free reign in the back or try and chop
And a couple of Bane chants in there would go a long way, I reckon, in that kind of army.
Sure.
That's something that I completely forewent in my army, which might seem really weak on the surface of it, and actually part of what motivated me to take so many pole arms, because I didn't have any Bane chant really available. But then when you got 4 monsters, you've got enough crushing, hopefully, to go around to deal with that kind of stuff. Well, yours, maybe you can go through it a little bit easier with like a really offensive, nasty kind of hammer style army. Maybe.
Yeah, but I'm hoping those troops are enough of a speed bump, and then I've got 2 very punchy, 3 very punchy hordes of things and enough shooting as well.
Yeah,
that's
good.
my idea.
Still based around the 3 hordes, and that is a good way to run Kingdoms of Men, I reckon. Heaps of hordes, heaps of flyers, heaps of ways to just block up the middle.
And if you're taking lots of troops, you kind of need something to unlock.
That's right.
And with all the characters, you kind of have to take it.
Yeah, I found with all the Kingdoms of Men fluffing about I did with army lists, I found that you want a lot of heroes, because those heroes, we went through them and we took the piss out of some of them, but they're really good generally, like because they're so cheap
for their price.
And again, like they make such good chaff units for their price. Those heroes are fantastic in Kingdoms of Men, and of course for me anyway, the general on Winged Beast is such an important part of the army, at least in the style of army that I took that was very offensive. So you really do kind of hurt for those unlocks, because hordes are all well and good. They'll unlock your monsters and your war machines happily, but then you end up wanting a couple of regiments in there as well, just so you can get enough hero unlocks. Because you want like 4, 5, 6 heroes if you can.
Right, so like, what do we got? You're the premier Kingdoms of Men player in.
It's worth
between the
saying
three
that
of us.
Sellick's played more Kingdoms of Men than Bensome or I. I think I've played about maybe only 5 or 6 games with them, against them quite a few times. But Sellick, you've probably got quite a bit more than that under your belt, don't you?
Yep, I played in 2 tournaments and a fair bit back in early second edition as well. But I went with a 2,000 point list. I've started off similar to Bensome, so I've gone with 2 hordes of foot guard, both replacing their shields with 2-handed weapons to give them that extra crushing 1. I've given them both Indomitable Will, and for foot guard horde number 1, I've given them the Brew of Strength, so they now go up to crushing strength 2. And I've given Blessing of the Gods, so elite on the other ones, just to help them out with their hits. I've then copied a little bit of Hugh's list there with 2 regiments of militia mobs. So I loved the 70-point unit strength 2 is just so handy. I've gone against the trend and went with 2 troops of handguns, just to have that little bit of piercing 2 at range. Just a handy pip damage there. I've then gone with 2 regiments of knights with the usual combos there. So Jesse's boots and Makwa is back out of his shop and has given me the caterpillar. Both of those 2 units with Indomitable Will, I've found that they waver too early, often with in critical turns with that 14 nerve. You can't take 2 regiments of knights without 2 troops of mounted sergeants. So I've gone with 2 of those just to help me out, shut down some flyers, make sure that my knights don't get chaffed up. Then I've gone, unfortunately, I couldn't afford the Winged Beast, so I've gone with 2 generals on Pegasus, one with the Blade of Slashing, that will sort of stick around with the body of my groups, and the other one with the Brew of Haste, which is more of the War Machine Hunter, or a bit more throwaway, I guess, compared to the others. I've naturally gone with the Army Standard Bearer, that is our Bard with the Loot, who's going to stick with everyone else as well, and my Flying Wizard with the Conjure Staff with Bane Chant 2, and just replacing his Fireball with Lightning Bolt.
Okay, so same setup.
So unit strength 1 on that flyer. He's
3
terrific.
Pegasus then.
Yep, 3 flying unit strength 1 units, which generally have played well. survive till the very end, and they can pull a game back. Even if you've been smashed, they can pull a game back, so it's not a massive loss.
Yeah, that's very true.
So that's 25 unit strength at 2,000 points and 14 drops.
That's a lot of drops, actually. You ended up with more than I thought.
Because of their militias, militia mobs.
Yeah.
I find that you either go with a lot of Kingdoms of Men army, they can look a little different in that if you either go with a regiment of knights, a single regiment, I suppose you could go none, but we all went for some. You can go with a regiment of knights and just have them as your useful standalone unit. But if you go with 2 regiments, you really need a fair bit of support for them. So like you've got there, so like you got a couple of mounted sergeants and you got a couple of heroes to support them as well. And they end up becoming like a really critical part of your army because you are investing like a good 450 odd points into those couple of regiments of knights. So I think it's a good way to play it. If you do have 2 regiments, you need to put those support elements in and commit, to the hilt.
Yeah, so I've been using the knights a little bit differently recently on purpose. So just trying to be hyper aggressive with them. So just picking out the unit that will hurt my army the most, and then knowing that they will be sacrificed, but just either taking out a unit or crippling that unit, and then using the pip damage that I've got to finish them off. Naturally, don't do it against regen units, but mixed success with that, because the 2 foot guard hordes that sort of come up slowly behind it all can generally mop up anything else. So they've got such a high nerve and such a good conversion rate to the wounds that they're very hard to take down in 2 turns, let alone 1 turn. So if you can take out the one thing that'll hurt the foot guard hordes with your knights, that's a great sacrifice, and you'll win more games.
Plus,
than
if you
lose.
use Games Workshop great swords to represent your foot guard hordes, they're going to look cool as hell. Although you will you probably need to take a second mortgage out on your house if you want to do that.
Yes. That's the downside.
That's it.
Yep. That brings us to the end of the Kingdoms of Men army review.
I think Kingdoms of Men are a bit underrated, boys. I'm going to throw that out there. I think people think they have a bit of a reputation, probably depends on your area of the world or whatever, of being one of the worst armies in Kings of War, like one of the weakest.
No, they're decent.
I think they're middle of the pack. I think they're a little underrated. I certainly don't think that they're like challenging like Abyssal Dwarfs, Auto Wound Dwarfs, as they're also known, for like the top tier kind of spectrum. But I think they can win against any army, and they can do, they can hold down a fort really well. They can certainly swarm the table with boots and claim objectives quite nicely, which is really good in an objective-based game that is Kingdoms of War. So I reckon
it's well balanced with nothing that stands out as being overpowered, or nothing apart from maybe chariots that are too underpowered.
Yeah. The biggest strength is heaps of cheap flyers and heaps of cheap infantry. I think it's their 2 biggest strengths. And outside of that, everything's sort of medium. They got like okay cavalry, okay shooting, okay this, okay that. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're okay.
They're okay.
Yeah. All right. Let us know if you're wrong or not, and I guess we'll get back to you on the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.
The great alliances of the past may be fading memories. Men are as likely to fight shoulder to shoulder with the elves and dwarves as they are to oppose them, and on many occasions, men have fought on both sides of the battle in these grand alliances. Men, however, most often fight other men, whether through greed or hatred, or honor, or just through misunderstanding. Humans are hot-blooded, not always wise. Their vivacity is a curse as much as it is a blessing.
Thank you for tuning in with my team. Make sure you follow on Facebook and Twitter. Yes, indeed, more than a game, it's a lifestyle. Yes, sir. Hope you realize that the math hammer doesn't work. We give the people what they desire. Australian War Gaming Podcast, direct Misfire. You don't want to miss a thing. Yeah, we got plenty more. If you're ready, let's go. Stay tuned, that's for sure. Hey.